This is my top 100 Zelda moments. I'll only be talking about the original 2D Zelda game, A Link to the Past, Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, The Wind Waker, Twilight Princess, Skyward Sword, and Breath of the Wild. Breath of the Wild, The Lord of the Mountain. The Satori Mountain lights up with a green glow at random times. It's a very intriguing sight to behold, and it's one of those events that can make you drop whatever you're doing to go and head towards it straight away. Zelda games can be great when they make surreal environments that stand out from anything else in its world. You feel like the game is giving you something entirely new. It's amazing that a Zelda game's soundtrack can be so large and varied now, that a single place like this will have its own unique music. The mountain is all about taming a spectral horse that appears in a pond of shallow water. I had tamed other horses before, and I wasn't too impressed by their riding mechanics, so finding another horse didn't feel like an amazing payoff, but still it was nice to have. It took me many attempts until I was able to tame the horse, which made it feel like a rare and precious creature that was satisfying to finally ride. I like how heavy the sound of the horse's hooves on the ground are, despite that it seems very light and graceful, giving it a sense of ethereality. The horse looks elegant with its white mane and ghostly green hide, yet the 4 red eyes on its face add an interesting touch of eeriness too. It's a funny detail how the stable owner won't allow you to register the horse and is very afraid of it. Although I had tamed other horses, I often preferred to travel by foot through Hyrule. Eventually I realised that horses pull you into set paths around the world, so understanding that made it feel better. One of the first times I properly rode around on horseback was with this Lord of the Mountain, and it came to feel like a relaxing, majestic experience. I like the twinkling passages from the piano that start the accompanying music, but the classic Zelda theme that fades in eventually turns it into a magical piece that enhances the sense of nostalgia I felt for the world after spending so much time exploring it. A Link to the Past, Guerrilla. The Guerrilla reflect the difference of approach for A Link to the Past. I see the original 2D Zelda as much more focused on combat and exploration, and the Guerrilla there moved independently like other enemies. A Link to the Past obviously still has combat, but it's much more focused on puzzle solving and doing cool things in dungeons. Enemies such as the Wizrobes were significantly slowed down, and they played out almost like a puzzle, as was the case with the redesigned Guerrilla. They mimic your movements, so you have to move in a certain way to get close to them and attack. The 2 smaller Guerrilla are easy, but the larger one is trickier, since its movement along the x-axis is inversed. If ever you end up face to face with him, he'll quickly shoot you with a fireball. You have to shoot an arrow across the screen and quickly move in a way to make him walk into it to kill him. It's quite clever and a unique encounter. Skyward Sword, second half of Skyview Temple. I was very hyped up about playing a new Zelda game when Skyward Sword came out, but the game initially struggled to maintain my enthusiasm. There were so many cutscenes, long lines of text, and not much in the way of dungeon content for such a long period of time. And most of all, the game's companion, Fi, was being annoying by stopping gameplay to explain every little thing. However, the first dungeon eventually won me over, and after that I really liked the game. The first half of this dungeon was fairly good. I liked how it felt like a forest temple, yet it contained elements from a water temple too. And the motion controls were putting a new spin on the puzzles and returning enemies, including the Skulltula. But entering the second half of the dungeon was when the game properly got going. Unlike the cramped areas that came before, suddenly it opened up into a huge cathedral-like area. The soundtrack grew more epic by layering additional material to its existing theme. Usually it's just the last dungeon in a Zelda game that does this. You get the Beetle item in this area, which lets you fly around and find hidden objects far above, as well as mess around cruelly with the bokoblin enemies. There's a mini boss battle with a Stalfos, which again has changed due to the motion controls, and an entirely new enemy with 3 heads. The game would still get better later on, but this was an important moment to get me interested in playing the rest of it. The Legend of Zelda opening credits. The original 2D Zelda game wasn't the first that I played, but when I eventually decided to give it a go, I was instantly won over by the game's opening credits. This is in large part because of the music. Just the opening note somehow sounds strange and exciting. And even with the limited sound technology, the soundtrack feels every bit as epic as the main Star Wars theme by John Williams. In fact, the whole thing is very reminiscent of Star Wars. Some of the enemy sprites look like they're from Return of the Jedi, and obviously the game uses opening rolling credits to establish a story. It did a great job of putting me into the mood for adventure. The Wind Waker, returning to the Forsaken Fortress. The first time you're in the Forsaken Fortress, you're very underpowered, and you have to sneak around enemies. But when you return later on, you not only have a sword, but you get a giant hammer too. The hammer can be used to squash some enemies in comedic style, but maybe the best moment is the battle against the giant bird, the Helmarok King. It was an enemy that appeared at the beginning of the game, and dispatched with Link very easily, but now with the giant hammer you can whack it into defeat. There's not much challenge to it, but it's still fun, and the visuals and music during the battle work really well. Breath of the Wild, First Guardian Stalker. A Guardian Stalker featured in the first ever footage shown of Breath of the Wild in 2014, indicating what the gameplay might be like in the full game. Unfortunately, I didn't deal with the Guardian as well as Link did in that trailer. I was roaming around Hyrule Field at night for the first time. I'd heard that Hyrule Castle was a dangerous area from an NPC. There was a tower nearby that I wanted to unlock, and I thought it was far away enough from the castle. But as I ran forward, some alarming battle music started playing suddenly, and a laser beam targeted me from afar. A giant walking octopus-like machine appeared in the distance. It was only my second day playing the game, and I didn't have much health or armor, so I tried running away. But the Guardian easily caught up. It took one shot from its laser and I got a game over. After I loaded a save file, I had learned to stay away from Hyrule Castle, and I went into another direction. Open world games containing powerful enemies that can one-hit kill you early on is a common thing by now, but the way it played out here made for a particularly memorable instance. Twilight Princess, Talking to Animals. Twilight Princess has a good number of dungeons, and I like those dungeons, but you're also required to do other things outside of dungeons as part of the main quest. Things that I don't enjoy, such as bug collecting, recovering Ilya's memory, and the game's slow opening. However, one moment I did enjoy from this opening is when you're transformed into a wolf, and have the ability to talk to the animals inside a village you had previously explored. You can talk to a squirrel, a dog, chickens, and even your horse Epona, something I still haven't done myself, but I've seen it on YouTube. When you talk to a chicken, it's amusing how eloquently the chickens seem to speak. It turns out they have quite a dignified personality, which makes the fact that Link attacks and torments them while in human form all the more amusing. The moment isn't heavy on gameplay, but it's a fantasy-like idea that's nice to see realised in a big game such as this. The Wind Waker, the Ghost Ship. The lead up to the Ghost Ship in the Wind Waker was very exciting, although it was a bit of a letdown in the end. Some list this as a mini-dungeon, yet once you're inside it, it looks like the interior of any other boat in the game, and it's filled with all the same enemies you've already faced. Nothing new. However, just to see it in the distance is a good moment. The first time I heard about it was on Great Fish Isle, where a talking fish said that it appears during night when the moon is a certain shape. This alone felt a little creepy, and quite similar to the aliens appearing in Majora's Mask. Then, later on another island, it was night. I looked out at the sea, and fairly close was the faint glimmer of a cursed ship. Some low-register music was playing, and it becomes louder when you get near it. It wasn't quite as scary as Zelda can sometimes be, but it was a pretty cool sight to see. Ocarina of Time, Opening the Well. In the hands of less talented developers, Kakariko Village could have looked a lot more boring. In other games, towns can be generic, uneventful places. But in Ocarina of Time, Miyamoto specifically told the team to put 3D to use and make landscapes less flat and more sloped. But beyond that, an area can also be made interesting by the secrets it can hold. Kakariko Village has a well in it that turns out to be a significant mini-dungeon. It's opened by a connection it holds with the windmill. Inside this windmill is a character who has his own theme tune, which is one of the best pieces of music in the game, the Song of Storms. This guy actually teaches you the song as an adult after complaining about how a child played it 7 years earlier to make the windfield turn fast. If you go back 7 years into the past, you'll end up being that child by playing the song to him, creating an amusingly deliberate time paradox. The windmill then spins around fast, and somehow that draws water from the well, so the entrance to the bottom of the well is opened up. Opening up dungeons can be one of the most exciting things in a Zelda game, and this was a nice way of doing that. Breath of the Wild, Akala Tower. Scaling towers in an overworld was done in Assassin's Creed, and I enjoyed doing it a fair bit, but I think Breath of the Wild did it better. I liked seeing a tower glow orange in the distance, and then gradually making my way towards it. I was exploring into each region in Breath of the Wild's overworld, unlocking the towers to get my map filled in, and places to fast travel to. But when it came to Akala, it felt different to the others. I glided near to it from a mountain and landed on some kind of ruined fortress. It's not like it was a dungeon, but the atmosphere was very striking with its relentless thunder and stony architecture. I chose to stealth through it for the most part, since the flying guardians still felt like a threat to me at the time. Climbing the tower ended up being a puzzle of sorts, since the bottom of it is blocked off. I managed to climb a tall arch and glide halfway onto the tower before scaling the rest of it. After the tower was unlocked, it was fun to see the map filled in, and a close overview of Death Mountain was a brilliant sight. Some of the other towers also added challenge in how they could be scaled, but for me the best one was in Akala. Twilight Princess, Zant's Hand. Hands in Zelda games usually mean something creepy is about to happen. In Twilight Princess's Palace of Twilight, a man-sized hand appears like a statue at the end of a series of rooms. You have to steal an orb from its grasp and head back through the rooms. But once you run away, the hand comes to life and chases you. Its movement is quite slow, but there are puzzles and obstacles to get through on your way back. It's not the creepiest moment in the series, but I still got spooked when I accidentally almost ran into the hand up a flight of stairs. And I liked it because it was one of the unique moments in Twilight Princess, rather than a recycled idea from previous games. Ocarina of Time, Goma. In earlier Zelda games, when you entered the boss room, the battle would initiate straight away. For some, getting on with it like this is a good thing, but for others like myself, I enjoy it when a game draws out the experience a bit more. In Ocarina of Time's first dungeon, the door shuts behind you when you enter the boss room. You're then allowed to wander around the murky lair. It's dark and grimy, and there's meant to be a boss somewhere here, but at first you can only hear it. It's up to the player to find the boss by looking up and seeing its luminous eye watching you from above. Then the camera zooms in, the boss drops down, and the battle begins. It's a clever way to extend the interaction and make the experience feel more dramatic. Breath of the Wild, Ice Keep. Breath of the Wild had a huge overworld, and it was important for them to fill that space with worthwhile areas. There are the many locations with recurring enemies and small Korok seed puzzles, but then there are the locations such as the Ice Keep, which are a genuine surprise to find. It's one of those instances where it doesn't look as though there's much to do at first, but eventually you unravel its secrets. It also allows Link to cause trouble once again. A guard stands watch to make sure the ice is well kept inside. Every time you try to melt it, she angrily throws you out. But I realised there was a bed nearby, and when she fell asleep at night I was able to attack the ice with my fire sword, and found a powerful bow inside as a reward. After melting the ice in Breath of the Wild, I was afraid to go back into the keep in case the guard was angry, but a shrine quest forced me to go back. It turned out she didn't really notice any difference, which was a little disappointing actually, but the shrine quest turned out to be a fun use of the location I didn't expect. You have to carry a cube of ice to a bartender nearby, but stay out of the sunlight that will melt the ice. It's neat how the game can recognise whether you're covered in the shadows of the overarching ruins or not. Overall, the Ice Keep was a fun location that offered more than one thing to do. A Link to the Past, Getting the Moon Pearl. A feature that A Link to the Past introduced was to have dungeons containing multiple floors. One neat aspect of this was that you could drop from one floor down to another below, at exactly the same position vertically. One instance of this occurs in the Tower of Hera. First you walk across the lower floor and see a treasure chest beyond a gap in the floor, with seemingly no way of accessing it. It's not until later on when you've explored a room on the floor above that you'll get the idea to drop through a hole to the area below. Once you do this, you fall right next to the chest and retrieve the item. A path opens up in front of the chest at this point so you can return to the rest of the dungeon. It's a clever way to implement the multiple floor dungeon design into a puzzle. Ocarina of Time, Dead Hand. The bottom of the well was scary for me when I played this as a child. I wanted to get it over with as quick as possible, and I was told that all I needed to do was play Zelda's Lullaby at the back and defeat Dead Hand for the Lens of Truth. So the many times I played this as a child, that's all I did. It wasn't until I was an adult that I explored the rest of the bottom of the well, and discovered that it had a few entirely unique areas, which felt strange after feeling like I knew the game like the back of my hand. In any case, Dead Hand was mandatory, and I always resented that as a child because of how creepy it felt. When you enter the room, there are tall white arms protruding out of the ground. When you get near one, it will quickly grab you by the throat, and battle music suddenly plays. Then the main part of the enemy reveals itself and makes its way towards you. Its face is pointing up out of sight on a long neck. When it gets close, the neck lowers to reveal its ugly face right in front of you, and it bites you with fangs. You have to give yourself to one of the hands to make the enemy appear, and lure yourself close to its face to attack and deal out damage. Ocarina of Time isn't a horror game, but when they tried to make unsettling enemy encounters, the Zelda team seems to get very creative. Other details that make Dead Hand unsettling are that it has its own voice or grunts, which is unusual for an enemy to have. It has two weird T-Rex-like arms, and when it dies, its corpse lingers and convulses on the ground for a long while, instead of disappearing straight away. Breath of the Wild, Dragon Naydra. When Breath of the Wild was first revealed at E3 2014, it was said that you could go to the mountains in the distance if you wanted to. This felt like something that had been said about many other games before, including those in the Elder Scrolls series, but I had confidence that Nintendo would do a much better job of filling in its locations and giving players more reason to journey up those mountains. Generally this is done by shrines, which usually offer a few dungeon-style puzzles, but sometimes it's something else. I saw the large mountain and assumed it would hold a secret. I was worried it might be another blessed shrine or an event in an NPC fetch quest, so I didn't bother exploring that mountain for a long time. Eventually I did start climbing it with my upgraded stamina meter, and I was pleased to come across something that was looking very strange. I don't think I had followed a path up the mountain that might have been the preferable route made by the developers, but stumbling across large purple claws and a reptile-like tail was both intimidating and intriguing. It turned out it was another one of the game's dragons. The first time I had seen Farosh flying through the air over Lake Hylia was a really good moment itself. Combined with the majestic music, it was a stunning and captivating sight. But the moment with Naydra was better because it involved some actual gameplay. I had already completed the Divine Beasts by this point, and had used the bow's slow motion feature in between hovering with the paraglider, so this fight with the dragon didn't feel so unique, but it was still an enjoyable event, and the mechanics retain a fair amount of fun even if they're repeated. I was hoping the dragons would lead to a major side quest of some kind. Early on I was imagining that they might lead to unlocking a large dungeon deep in the overworld. Instead you just have to shoot them with an arrow, and their scales you collect lead to blessed shrines. Despite this disappointment, encountering Naydra on top of the mountain is a slice of gameplay that's more satisfying than what you usually expect out of any side quest content of a more normal game. Seeing the dragon fly through Hyrule like the other dragons after feels pretty nice, as though you freed an animal and restored part of the world back to its former glory. Majora's Mask, Stealing the Room Key. One brilliant thing about Majora's Mask is its secrets, and the amount of side content that's left up to the player to discover. I only played the game a second time much later as an adult, and was surprised to realise how much content I had missed playing it for the first time. One amusing secret that almost made this list was when you find a hidden room and see the Master Swordsman hiding and quivering because he's afraid of the moon falling and the world coming to a fiery end. It's funny yet also quite sad. I like how a lot of NPCs refer to something going on in the world, establishing a coherence to the game and its story. But another secret I liked even more was to do with the inn. If you speak to the innkeeper, Anju, at the right time, she'll ask for your name. It just so happens that there's a reservation filed under your name, so you're given a room key. Later on a Goron enters, and his name is the exact same as whatever file name you created. Sometimes I wonder whether this is Darunia's son from Ocarina of Time grown up. He made the reservation, but he finds that the room has been taken already. We can go inside the room and find a large rupee. But we can also go outside and watch as the Goron complains about the world being cruel and unfair, before having to sleep outside in the cold at night. The pained expression on his face again makes the secret a bit sad as well as funny. The Wind Waker, Gliding with the Deku Leaf. Majora's Mask had the Deku Scrub's hovering ability, and the Wind Waker's Deku Leaf follows on from that, but makes the journey through the air smoother and longer lasting. It also fits in nicely with the game's directional wind mechanic. It's pretty neat gliding to the Forbidden Forest early on, but my favourite use of the Deku Leaf is gliding all the way to the Moai-like rock face on Outset Island. With the initial magic meter you can just about make it before falling down. Breath of the Wild, Magnetic Hidden Door. It's common in Zelda games to get an item in a dungeon that you then use to solve all of the dungeon's puzzles. It's fun to use the item and appreciate all the ways the designers managed to make use of its abilities, but it usually makes progression through the dungeon uncomplicated. I liked how Skyward Sword introduced abilities in the game's general mechanics early on that would then come into use throughout the rest of the game, such as sprinting, bowling and skydiving. These abilities would come into use inside dungeons, so it wasn't all about simply using whatever dungeon item you would get to progress. But Breath of the Wild took this further by giving you all of the abilities dungeon items would normally grant you early on, so it's up to you to keep these abilities in mind when figuring out puzzles throughout the game. It's not always obvious what will work at first. A good example of this is inside the Yiga clan hideout. I sneaked past some guards into an important room, but was surprised to find how empty the area seemed to be. There was a treasure chest, which typically in Zelda would contain an enemy that would solve every puzzle and enemy in the surrounding area, but here it contained a joke item that granted no extra abilities. I spent a long time in this area until I thought to use the magnesis ability on some other chests half buried in the ground. While scanning for magnetic objects, I was pleased to discover a hidden door inside one of the room's walls. Hidden doors are always exciting, but it's up to the developers to think up ways that they might thoughtfully be discovered. This game didn't disappoint, since the mechanics you used to find it had been established early on, and discovering the hidden door came to feel logical and clever. Skyward Sword, Skydiving. Some people take well to the motion controls of Skyward Sword, others complain about it. I personally had very few problems with them. I don't think I'd want every Zelda game to have them, and I didn't like any of the motion controls used in Breath of the Wild, but it made for something new back in 2011, and certain uses of it felt very nice. One of these uses was in skydiving. It's a feature that would come into play many times throughout the whole game, and it always felt great. You drop into loading areas in some places, such as Skyloft from the sky, but in others it was great how you would seamlessly drop to the ground. An additional challenge could be created in trying to take out the parachute as close to the ground as possible. I also enjoyed moving Link as close as he could get to the side of a building while diving without breaking the fall. Controlling this action with motion controls felt very intuitive and satisfying. Ocarina of Time, Redead. One of the creepiest enemies in Ocarina of Time is some kind of zombie, but as is usual for the Zelda series, they put a unique spin on it rather than making it generic. In other games like Oblivion, creatures are plucked right out of fantasy cliché with no imagination on the developer's part at all. But in Ocarina of Time, the zombie-like Redeads have been made to be tall, emaciated figures with faces like the Scream by Edward Munch. Just when looking at them from afar, you don't really want to have anything to do with them, but the game tests your courage by putting you against them. A feature used to make all of the scary enemies in this game unsettling is that they take the control away from you temporarily in different ways. Here the Redeads paralyze you if they see you, and if they get close they will wrap their gnarly bodies around you, so it can be panicky attacking them in the back with your sword, hoping they won't turn around to grab a hold of you. The sounds are also effective, with low wailing sighs and the surprising high-pitched scream. A neat addition that most people miss is that if you kill one, another nearby will start walking towards the corpse of its friend, presumably to try and eat it before it fades away. Breath of the Wild, flying into Hateno. Possibly the best form of flight in the Zelda series came in Breath of the Wild with the paraglider. You get it very early on, and use it to glide off the Temple of Time and Great Plateau. Those might be good moments, but you can glide from bigger heights later on, and make the flight last longer with upgraded stamina. I think the best moment with the paraglider is using it to fly into Hateno Village. There is a shrine lower down in Hateno, but maybe the developers didn't place one higher up, because it would encourage players to warp to the laboratory instead, and glide all the way down to Hateno from there. It's a long seamless flight that shows off the impressive nature of the game's expansive open world. Majora's Mask, hand in toilet. There's a very small room inside Majora's Mask's inn that has a hole in it. I didn't realise this when I first played the game, but it's meant to be an old style toilet. In any case, one time I was playing the game while my younger brother was watching, and he told me that when he was watching my older brother play the game earlier, there was a hand in that small room. But for a long time I wasn't seeing anything other than that hole. A few days later I was playing by myself at night. While walking around the inn, no music was playing. All you could hear were somehow unsettling noises of a clock turning, maybe a pan of water boiling, and beetles scuttling on the floor. Then I went inside the small room, and suddenly a large creepy hand emerged out of the hole with a high-pitched sound. It scared the hell out of me, and I turned off the console because I was so shocked by it. When playing the game again, I avoided the inn for a long time, and it took me a while until I eventually went back to that small room. It turns out you can speak to the hand, and it asks for paper. If you give him some, it uses the paper within the hole out of sight and rewards you with a piece of heart. It also gives the thumbs up. I guess the reason they included a hand as an NPC is because they wanted to reference the strange hand that acted as an NPC in the overworld of A Link to the Past. But in that game it was a cute sprite, whereas here the hand is somewhat realistic looking. It had a gnarly appearance, it was bigger than Link, and its erratic animation was unsettling. I thought it was trying to attack me at first. I guess it's meant to be funny, but overall it was scary for me, and a very memorable moment. Breath of the Wild, Passing of the Gates. I'd suggest that Breath of the Wild has just as much dungeon content as any other Zelda game, but it's scattered into bite-sized trials called shrines across an expansive overworld and often made difficult to discover. This isn't my preferred setup for a Zelda game. I like having a main quest containing a good number of proper dungeons that are distinct from one another, but the new approach still worked and it was nice to have something new. It's just a shame that the majority of shrines weren't all that good, especially compared to the puzzles I enjoyed in the Divine Beasts. The Passing of the Gates shrine was a brief but satisfying highlight. I spent a long time trying to work out how a large apparatus that gets flipped on its side could be used to get me further. Lots of things I tried were failing, but eventually the brilliant moment came when I went into slow motion while firing my bow in mid-air, and after hitting the switch, the apparatus flipped beneath me, providing a path to the end of the shrine. I'm not sure if I'd worked it out correctly before I'd completed the solution. It felt like I was doing trial and error, but the act of carrying out the solution was fun and rewarding anyway. If only most of the 120 shrines were like this one. Ocarina of Time, Bongo Bongo. Bongo Bongo is yet another creepy enemy with hands in Ocarina of Time. Given the limits of the N64 compared to the GameCube, it's quite surprising how quickly those hands can move. The Wind Waker had a similar boss in the Tower of the Gods, yet despite the more capable console and polish brought on by the Wind Waker's graphics engine, it moved slower and was much easier to defeat. Bongo Bongo shouldn't be all that hard, yet I struggled against it a fair bit the first time. Maybe it was because of how the hands can avoid shots when going to attack, or how you're bounced up and down by the drum that the boss beats. When starting the battle I had no idea what the boss would be like, and I felt panicked about what it would do while fighting. I think that finicky quality is needed in boss battles, otherwise it's too easy and boring. I also like it when a boss holds amusing secrets, like the way you can shoot one of Bongo Bongo's hands with an ice arrow, and the other hand will try to thump it to shatter the ice. Barely anyone would have found that out if it wasn't for the internet, and even then most people don't know about it. The visual design on the boss is also interesting, and has led to some theories about how it was a monster that got its hands and head cut off by a guillotine sometime in the past. Its face looks like the bloody stump of a neck. It ties in well with the theme of the boss's dungeon, since the Shadow Temple contains guillotines and torture devices, and speaks about Hyrule's bloody history. Bongo Bongo was a cool boss and a great way to finish off the Shadow Temple. Twilight Princess, Dark Beast Ganon. Early on in Twilight Princess you are confronted by a charging goat and allowed to wrestle it to the ground. This mechanic is brought back with the Gorons, where you can wrestle them to the ground while using the iron boots, but then the game neatly brings the mechanic back towards the end of the game in a boss fight with Dark Beast Ganon, tying the start of the game to the end in a brief moment. Watching out for where the Beast Ganon will appear around you is also fun, but more than anything else I like about this moment is the music. It uses a unique mix of male vocals and a guitar, and it sounds eerie but really cool. A Link to the Past, Chicken Attack. One of the most popular secrets in Zelda is how chickens attack you if you attack them for too long. It's been a long-running feature in the series. Ocarina of Time did it, and the Wind Waker had a large pet pig get angry and attack you. I had already heard about the secret before playing A Link to the Past, yet somehow I'd forgotten about it. I started attacking the chickens with my sword and cornering them. Then when I had attacked one for too long, a whole swarm of them came to get me, surprising me and making me run away. The possibility of getting a game over from being killed by chickens makes it even funnier. Majora's Mask, Seeing the Moon. Just the act of looking up and seeing the moon in the sky is enough to make a memorable moment in this game. I played Majora's Mask in 2001, but I first watched my older brother play a bit of it before. While in Clocktown, he went into first person to look up at the moon, which I hadn't yet seen. Its deathly face stared back down. Just the idea of a moon falling slowly to obliterate the world might have been enough, but to put such a face on it was a good touch. I also like how the angle of the moon changes depending on where you are in the game's world, adding a bit of geographical continuity to the world. My older brother lied to me that my save file would get deleted if I let the moon fall, which put further pressure on the situation. For this reason I never ended up letting the moon fall, and I still haven't done after all of these years, although I've seen the cutscene of it happening on YouTube, and it's genuinely dramatic and chilling. I have a theory that the moon is Majora's Mask's version of Ganon. The face looks a lot like Ganondorf's face during his last cutscene in Ocarina of Time. You also see Ganondorf's face on a large ball of fire, a bit like a moon in Twilight Princess. The wizard in A Link to the Past also sets about resurrecting Ganon to destroy the world, and I think a similar thing happens in the second Zelda on the NES. Maybe an early idea for Majora's Mask involved the Skull Kid threatening to summon Ganon after 3 days, but it was changed into a moon instead. If so, I'm glad that they went with the moon, because it works really well. Ocarina of Time, Shadow Temple fans. I completed the Shadow Temple before the Spirit Temple in Ocarina of Time, so it wasn't even the penultimate dungeon, even though it came so late in the game after so much other content. I couldn't believe how many incredible ideas the designers were coming up with. It was such a lengthy adventure that asking for more would be beyond greedy. The last parts of Ocarina of Time have many cool moments, including the part with the fans in the Shadow Temple. After first completing the game I had forgotten all about this area, simply because the game was so big that it's hard to remember it all, and I was pleased to rediscover the area on a second playthrough. At first it's quite simple to weigh yourself down with the iron boots to walk forward, while not being blown away by the strong wind created by the fans. Later on there are several fans trying to blow you into chasms either side of the room. This means using the iron boots again, but eventually you'll have to figure out you need to use the hover boots instead. There's a room hidden by a fake wall you can expose with the lens of truth. The only way of getting there is by putting on the hover boots, and allowing one of the fans to blow you forward over the chasm. Just when I was thinking the dungeon wasn't making particularly clever use out of its item, it pulls this trick out of the bag, and impresses me once again. A Link to the Past, start of the game. I like it when a Zelda game puts you into the dungeon early on. That's often when the game feels like it's properly got going, since the dungeon designs are usually the highlights of the game. I appreciate how Ocarina of Time puts you into a proper fully fledged dungeon right after you've got a sword and shield. For first time players, exploring Kokiri Forest while trying to find a sword and rupees to buy a shield will introduce them to the mechanics of the game. But on the second playthrough you'll know how to get the items easily, and you'll be in the dungeon in no time. But in terms of getting things going quickly, A Link to the Past did it even better, putting us into Hyrule Castle almost straight away. And before you get there, it's exciting how you're left to venture out while the rain is pouring down and dramatic music is playing. This feels like how Zelda games should begin, and since we're mentioning A Link to the Past's opening, I'll also praise the menu, the music of which is great at setting the mood for action and adventure. Breath of the Wild, entering Rito Village. Entering a brand new location in a Zelda game can easily become a highlight. I was always excited about coming across the Rito Village in Breath of the Wild. I knew it existed and I couldn't wait to see what it was like. But something that can really make arriving in a new place great is the soundtrack. The Dragon Roost Island music is a great piece from The Wind Waker, so it was satisfying to hear it again with a new rendition in this game. The orchestral accompaniment is nice, but the best part is how a clarinet plays the theme, adding a homely somber quality to the piece. There were a couple of niggles affecting the introduction to the Rito village. The frame rate suffered quite a bit, and a fairly pointless cutscene establishing the Divine Beast I had already seen since the beginning of the game broke up the seamlessness of the experience, but overall it was a really good moment. Twilight Princess, Magnets in the Goron Mines. Twilight Princess took a while to properly get going. There were some good moments early on, but I think most people say the game really hits its stride all the way after the third dungeon. However, after the slow pace of scenes in Kakariko Village, I feel the pace picks up when you make your way towards Death Mountain, helped by the upbeat music of the Gorons. But also the second dungeon has some cool ideas that makes me feel the designers were finally letting loose with their creativity. The moment for me came when you enter a room filled with water. The Wind Waker contained a lot of water, yet unlike in Zelda on the N64, you never went inside it, so being able to do so in Twilight Princess felt like a long time in the coming. But beyond that, you also used the game's iron boots to anchor yourself onto walls and ceilings with magnets. This is utilised in quite a few different ways. You can fight enemies while upside down, a large magnetised device can carry you around as you shoot arrows, a mini boss battle happens on a giant magnetised floor, and you have to make your way carefully over a rotating platform with magnetised segments. The GameCube Zelda games opted to repeat a lot of ideas from Zelda on the N64, but it was nice when they introduced something unique such as this. The Wind Waker, getting the Master Sword. One of the most memorable moments from The Wind Waker happens when you go beneath the ocean and into a locked away Hyrule on land. At first it's completely black and white, and it looks cool how Link is still coloured green as he walks around. Everything is in a standstill, and the music sounds like it's frozen, with rumblings far off in the distance. When you pick up the Master Sword, colour returns, and everything reanimates. It's pretty cool to see stained glass windows of the sages from Ocarina of Time. Then when you go back upstairs, a lengthy battle ensues with moblins and dark nuts. In The Wind Waker, combat is always easy to get through. It's mostly hack and slash and pressing A at the right moment, like a QuickTime event. I don't remember ever getting a game over in the game, but it's still nice to look at, since the animations are fun and exciting, and when the enemies are gone, taking in the atmosphere with its visuals and soundtrack can again be enjoyed. Skyward Sword, Koloktos. Bosses in Zelda games aren't usually challenging, but at least they might look spectacular and involve a fun mechanic. The ancient system was an impressive dungeon, and Koloktos was a great way to cap it off. It's a large statue with multiple arms holding giant swords. Dealing out damage to the boss is very satisfying. You yank its arms off using the motion controls and steal one of its giant swords. With this you can cut the boss down to size by hacking apart its body. There's not much else to say about it, it's just simple fun. Although it's odd how at times the boss seems to have the voice of a giggling toddler, despite that we're hacking and slashing it to pieces. Breath of the Wild, Eventide Isle. This moment came shortly after I'd completed the main quest. I was disappointed that there weren't proper dungeons in the game, or just more divine beasts. Even though the main quest told me defeat Ganon, I'd hoped it would be a midway point like in previous Zelda games, after which more dungeons would open up in other regions. But no, the end credits rolled. So after this disappointment it took a lot for the game to win me back, and eventually it did. Mostly it was the overworld exploration and a handful of shrines that made a good impression on me. This included Eventide Isle, which repeats a lot of what you see elsewhere in the overworld, but since I hadn't explored much by this point, it was actually new to me. There's also the fact that the game strips you of your armor and items when you first step onto it, which mixes things up and adds to the challenge. Elsewhere it was the first time I encountered the Hinox. I didn't want to wake it up since I normally opt to stealth through games if given the choice. However, I accidentally dropped an orb and it rolled all the way down to him, waking him up. It's pretty funny how the enemy can pull out trees to use as a weapon and how he blocks his vulnerable eye with a hand. The inclusion of a lot of other enemies on the island made this one of the first sandbox-style moments of combat, where I experimented with all abilities to take down enemies, including magnesis and bombs. I'd later find out that the game's world is filled with so many of these Cyclops enemies, but facing one upon this island early on went some way towards getting me over the shortness of its main quest. Twilight Princess, Hyrule Castle. Most of the gameplay in Twilight Princess's last dungeon wasn't too special. At first it's just waves of enemies you've already faced, and then a few simple puzzles and repeated mini-boss battles. But the atmosphere getting through Hyrule Castle is great. I liked how the place wasn't actually in ruins this time. The place could look fairly elegant, but just the emptiness inside made it feel unsettling and dark. The tone gets more intense the higher you get, and, more than the visuals and enemies, this is helped by the music. It reuses the Hyrule Castle theme again, but it builds on the theme the further you get. At first it's just a lonely flute eerily sounding out the theme, but the strings and brass eventually enter into it, creating a sense of danger and foreboding. The flute continues above it all, now sounding fragile and exasperated. I found other attempts Twilight Princess made at being dark or grandiose to be underwhelming, but this was a moment that felt genuinely epic and spectacular. Ocarina of Time, chain reaction of bombs on stairs. Dodongo's Cavern distinguished its own style and aesthetic as soon as you enter it. You blow up a wall to reveal the main hub of the dungeon, which contains the large skull of a full-sized Dodongo. Eventually you will plant and blow up bombs in the skull's eye sockets to open up its mouth and gain entrance towards the boss. The boss itself is pretty cool, although very easy, and I especially like its death animation, but an even better moment lies elsewhere in the dungeon. Bombs worked very well in this game, and one cool feature is that one bomb exploding can make another blow up. In one room you have to plant a bomb in the gap between a row of other bombs, so that a chain reaction of bomb explosions occurs, causing a flight of stairs to tremble and fall into place, providing a path to the upper parts of the dungeon. It shouldn't be too hard to figure out that this is what you have to do, but seeing it all unfold, first the explosions happening in game time, and then the stairs falling in a cutscene, accompanied with the classic Zelda chime, is a satisfying moment that proved how 3D could turn Zelda's puzzles into spectacular awe-inspiring events. Breath of the Wild, Lightning Shrine. Opening up a new dungeon in Zelda games can create some spectacular and exciting moments. Unfortunately, Breath of the Wild mostly didn't satisfy this aspect for me, since its dungeon content is scattered into shrines. Opening up one of these just doesn't have the same impact as discovering a proper fully fledged dungeon. I guess flying towards the first maze I went to was exciting, but ultimately the area came to feel mediocre. In any case, revealing shrines from underground is still neat, and one of the cleverer shrine quests is one in which you have to blow up a mound that the shrine is encased in. There's a thunderstorm happening when you are near this shrine, and eventually I remembered that you could conduct lightning with metallic objects. Usually I would put my sword away so that I wouldn't get struck by lightning, but in this case I left it out and stood upon the mound. After a while a bolt of lightning came down with a huge blast. Luckily I survived it, but the mound was destroyed and the shrine was revealed. There's no extra content inside the shrine, but just solving the puzzle to get into it was a fun and creative moment. Ocarina of Time, Breaking a Cobweb. One brilliant aspect about Ocarina of Time's dungeon design is how they're made memorable by distinctive set pieces, and how their designs are based around a specific theme. The first dungeon takes place inside a large tree, so the music conveys the sound of wind passing through hollow wood, with the use of what sounds like a glass harmonica. Also, the walls are bark and covered in cobwebs, and the dungeon is structured to be tall and circular. One of the first things you'll notice in the dungeon is a cobweb on the floor covering up a hole leading down to a floor below. You won't be able to interact with it until you climb to the top of the dungeon, jump down the center, and break the cobweb with the force of your fall. The classic Zelda chime plays and you fall into a body of water in the floor below. It puts the dungeon's theme and structure to clever use, and moments like this help make the game's dungeons to be interesting and memorable. Breath of the Wild, Ice Cube Shrine. This was the 119th shrine I completed in Breath of the Wild, and it was well worth the wait. You have to carry a block of ice all the way to the monk at the end, but there are flames blocking your way. Some of these flames are easy to cast aside using a metal block and the magnesis ability, but there was one last obstacle at the end that had me stuck for a long while. I attempted many different methods, including one that clearly wasn't intentional. I thought I could maybe carry the ice cube to where I wanted on top of a metal block using the magnesis ability. Sometimes I think it still might have worked with more perseverance. Later on I got the right idea to use stasis, but I still needed more time to work out how I could properly implement it to get through as I needed. When I finally figured out the correct solution, it felt very satisfying in the way that solving puzzles should be. This shrine and others like it, bit by bit, helped make up for the game's shortage of proper dungeons. The Wind Waker, hookshot with iron boots. Zelda games can be delightful in how clever their puzzle ideas are. That moment when you get an idea of how to solve a puzzle and then see your plan come to fruition when it works, and to hear the Zelda chime play, can bring a smile to anyone's face. I think the best example of this in The Wind Waker happens inside the Wind Temple. A large statue is blocking the entrance to a small prison. It has a hookshot target on it, but if you latch onto it, you merely get pulled to the statue and nothing happens. However, if you wear the iron boots while using the hookshot, the statue will be pulled towards you instead. The statue topples over and crumbles, and the Zelda chime plays. It's a neat little puzzle that made a clever combination of the game's items. Maybe it didn't need it, but sometimes I think it could have been made more spectacular through the use of a more elaborate animation and a cutscene, which would have enhanced the feeling of satisfaction about it. In any case, the moment felt especially good since it was one of the Wind Waker's unique ideas. A Link to the Past, Ganon in Pyramid of Power. The best boss in A Link to the Past was saved until last. The Helmasaur King looked really cool, but I don't think the fight played out as well, and Ganon also looks really good. The main reason I took damage from the Helmasaur King was because of the tail that lashes out suddenly. Ganon's attacks feel a little fairer and more avoidable, yet a lot can still end up happening on screen at once, including the ring of fireballs, the flaming bats, the falling floor tiles, and Ganon himself warping across the arena. He also uses invisibility in some stages, like in the original Zelda, but now you can make him visible by lighting the nearby torches. The animation of him hiding his face with his cloak in reaction to the light is pretty cool. It's strange how he refers to you as lad, as if he's from Scotland, but the idea of him conversing with you while in beast form is actually quite amusing. It's pretty easy to take a lot of damage, so it can be tense trying to land a shot with a silver arrow when he is stunned for a small amount of time. The fight feels epic because it comes at the end of such a long and exciting adventure. It might not have the same level of spectacle as final battles in other Zelda games, but it's a pretty nice fight with some good action, and for that reason it's a satisfying way to finish the game. Majora's Mask, Goat. Maybe Majora's Mask featured some recycled content from Ocarina of Time, but I think it's fair to say it contained a lot of originality too. There must have been some pressure to come up with more of its own ideas, since it was a direct sequel to Ocarina of Time and reused its graphics engine and other assets, so it would have been harder to disguise and get away with simply repeating ideas all the time. The bosses show off Majora's Mask's creativity. Their designs are based on the new abilities the mask transformations give you, especially the second boss. As a Goron, you're able to roll around at a fast pace, and Goat puts that to use by turning the boss battle into some kind of race. The whole arena is a racetrack. You have to catch up to the boss to deal out damage, while avoiding falling debris and lightning strikes. I also like how you're made to initiate the battle by unfreezing the boss with a fire arrow. Bosses in later Zelda games would always appear whimsical and comical, but I liked how bosses in Majora's Mask would feel genuinely intimidating. The grunts and cries they make are deeply voiced and unsettling. Their appearances are gritty and colossal, and due to their positioning in the battle, as well as the use of lighting, they're partly kept in the shadows and made to appear mysterious. That otherworldly characteristic is great at making a boss battle tense, but the main appeal about Goat is just how surprisingly fun and unique the battle is. Skyward Sword, Ancient Cistern's Underbelly. The Ancient Cistern was interesting because of the variety it offered in one dungeon. It already looked great from the start with its huge room containing a Buddha-like statue. But then you're flushed down into a sewer system to stumble across the cisterne's dark underbelly, where the tone is completely different. It's like the upper half is heaven, and the lower half is hell. It doesn't convey this difference as strikingly as games potentially could, but it's still a really neat feature. Rather than settling on one theme, the dungeon feels like a mix of a spirit temple, water temple, shadow temple, forest temple, and parts of it even look like the Dodongo's cavern. This kind of variation and contrast of different tones can work to make dungeons more memorable and interesting. Breath of the Wild, looking at the overworld. Zelda games create an adventure that you embark upon, and hopefully some way into it you'll feel that you're absorbed in an ongoing saga. The game has thrown so many cool ideas at you, you've been through so many dungeons, and visited lots of places and characters, that before you've even completed it you will start reminiscing about the journey. This first happened for me with Ocarina of Time. The fact that you play through areas as a child and revisit those areas later as an adult leads you to remember the times you spent previously, possibly drawing out nostalgia, or just making you feel you've progressed far into the game. But it was every time I returned to the menu screen that made me reflect on the journey I was going through. While other games typically had overblown menu screens with in-your-face CGI and flashy music, I admired how serene and understated Ocarina of Time's menu was. It always put me into a meditative mood. It slowed me down and let me appreciate what an interesting and exciting game this was. Possibly there were moments like this for me in Majora's Mask, The Wind Waker and Twilight Princess. One time in Skyward Sword I was looking out at lights and stars in the distance from Beedle's Island, and I remember thinking that the mood was similar but not quite as significant, although I did enjoy the game overall. Then Breath of the Wild came along, and I think it's simple to recognise how the game can create this kind of mood very easily. All you need to do is look at the overworld. The game does this for you in an early cutscene, and I remember continuing to gaze out at the horizon after the game tried leading me to the Temple of Time. Seeing mountains and forests and the divine beasts far away filled me with a huge amount of anticipation. But then after you've explored the world, looking out at the overworld starts to become a reflective experience. It's awe-inspiring to recognise the scope of this game, and what a huge journey it's put you through. Even just visually, there's a lot to be admired in how the landscape twists and turns, in ways to give each of its locations unique character. The fact that Breath of the Wild uses an understated soundtrack for its overworld reinforces the serene atmosphere and recaptures the meditative mood from Ocarina of Time's menu. For a long time in gaming, stopping and looking at a beautiful landscape has been enjoyable, but it's never been done better than in Breath of the Wild. Ocarina of Time, Iron Knuckle. The Iron Knuckle is another instance in Ocarina of Time where the battle doesn't start as soon as you enter the room. The enemy might look like a statue when you first see it. It's not until you attack it yourself that it gets up, as if it's daring you to fight. The first time you encounter it is as a child, despite that it's in one of the last dungeons, which makes it look all the more intimidating. It moves fairly slowly at first, as though it's overconfident or just weighed down by heavy armour. It's fun how it breaks the pillars in its room, and even its own throne if you move towards it. If you hookshot the enemy, you'll be pulled towards it instead of it towards you, because of how heavy it is. It's always a nice addition to a fight when in a second stage the enemy gets angrier and moves faster. I like how the fight is designed so you have to lure the enemy into attacking, which leaves the enemy vulnerable if you dodge it. It's all the more tense because of how much damage the axe can make. But another detail that can easily be missed about the Iron Knuckle is that they all contain a Gerudo woman inside. The third Iron Knuckle you face is revealed to contain a possessed Nibiru, under the spell of the two witches. The same character model is inside all of the Iron Knuckles, although you could choose to believe that they're different. Maybe every eye knuckle is created by the witches casting spells on different Gerudo women. You have to get the angle right, but once you see it, it's pretty unsettling seeing their eyes wide open inside. Twilight Princess, double claw shot. After a pretty cool mini boss fight in the City of the Sky, I was completely surprised to find an upgrade to the claw shot, and it turned out to be a great addition. Just a single claw shot or hook shot alone was a neat item as soon as the Link to the Past introduced it, allowing you to whip across areas by latching onto targets. But the coolest version is the double claw shot, which allows you to fly between targets quickly and spectacularly while hanging onto walls. I didn't find the boss battle that uses it to be all that impressive, since the claw shot makes things too easy, with its stepping stones in the sky being very plain to see, but the novelty of the item early on and the surprise of it made for a good moment. Skyward Sword, Isle of Goddess drops below the clouds. The Zelda games have had some unique moments in their narrative, and there's usually enough there for fans to craft their own flights of fancy about their backstory and themes. But I still don't generally think of story as being one of the series' strong points. If it's not going to deliver characterization that's every bit as good as its brilliant game design, I'd prefer it to minimalize story altogether. I didn't like the majority of cutscenes and characters in Breath of the Wild and Twilight Princess. You can sometimes skip them, but that still feels like a negative. Skyward Sword had a lot of cutscenes, yet they didn't seem to bother me as much. I actually enjoyed the buffoonery of Groose because of just how silly he was, but the twists at the end of the game were surprisingly impressive. I liked how two seemingly different characters turned out to be the same person, and the way the last dungeon fell through the clouds and onto the sealed grounds below was spectacular. Given that there were two areas I'd explored before, especially the sealed grounds, it came as a complete surprise, and it was nice to see how neatly they fit together. Breath of the Wild, the Lynel. The first time I encountered a Lynel in Breath of the Wild was just after I found my first photo location near Kakariko Village. It looked like an interesting location to explore, but the Lynel worried me. I thought I could maybe sneak up to it to get a closer look, but it took notice of me very quickly. I thought it might get hostile soon, so I decided to attack first. My arrows didn't do much, and then I was shocked to see that the Lynel had not just a bow of its own, but magical ice arrows too. This quickly led to a game over, and then I knew to leave them alone. So sneaking around a Lynel near the Zora's domain came to feel all the more unsettling. Eventually I took on a Lynel inside Hyrule Castle and defeated it. They're surprisingly agile like a Guardian Stalker. They have a broad range of attack animations, and their extensive health meter can make for a long-lasting fight. It turns out that their arrows can stretch a very long distance too, which I was shocked to find out after I had tried running and hiding away. It was an intimidating enemy in the 2D games, and I guess Nintendo wanted to take their time to get them right when bringing them into 3D. Ocarina of Time, Wallmaster. The Wallmasters featured in the original 2D game in A Link to the Past, where their design idea was simple, but their appearance was unsettlingly realistic compared to other enemies. In Ocarina of Time they look all the more scary, like half spider and half hand. The way they scuttle along the floor and turn around is creepily animated. When I played this as a child, one of the worst things to come across was Navi telling me to watch out for shadows on the ceiling. A sense of dread fell upon me every time a Wallmaster's shadow surrounded Link. I hated the idea of one of those things falling down on my head, and if they've landed on the floor, it's a frantic rush to kill them before they escape back up. There are also the Floor Masters, which divide into smaller versions when defeated. They latch onto you like facehuggers. Probably the most memorable moment with a Wallmaster was in the last dungeon. I reached a room that usually contained an orb for me to shoot with a light arrow, but the room was empty. Later on I found out it was a fake room leading to the real one if you use the Lens of Truth. But if you stand around too long wondering why the orb isn't there, a Wallmaster will come down and grab you by surprise. It's pretty sneaky but fun of the developers to play on our expectations like that. A Link to the Past, Skullwood's entrances. Entrances into dungeons can potentially be epic moments, and while entering Skullwoods isn't exactly epic, it uses a wonderfully original idea. It's quite a surprise when you realise you've entered it, because the first entrance you'll use won't exactly look like one. The dungeon has several small entrances spread out over the Dark Forest area. You must re-enter the dungeon by dropping into it at different positions to explore and progress through its structure. The aesthetic inside the dungeon doesn't look particularly great, but the Dark Forest area above with the Death Mountain music is fantastic. I managed to get through the dungeon using trial and error exploration and not thinking about it too much. But I think you're supposed to activate a switch, leave the dungeon, re-enter it from a different entrance, and progress through a path that the switch opened up. I've heard that it's possible to skip a part of the dungeon, but the whole setup is a neat idea nonetheless. A ROM hack of Ocarina of Time called Nimpai's Adventure turned the Shadow Temple into something like the Skull Woods, by making holes under graves in the graveyard entrances into different parts of the dungeon. But in the official Zelda games, A Link to the Past Skull Woods feels completely unique. Twilight Princess, Zant. The battle with Zant didn't have many of its own ideas, but it was a crazy ride that was fun to play. Considering how calm and dignified Zant appeared to be in the rest of the game, you'd have thought his movements would be slower and more cerebral, but maybe that's how Ganondorf is, so Zant needed to be a bit stranger. The battle places you into previous boss arenas, including mini-boss battles, mixing it up slightly with Zant's own attacks. The visuals are really nice, especially the sight of large replicas of Zant's mask raising underwater. I'm glad they reused the Blizzetta boss battle, and it's fun hitting Zant's toe and seeing him shrink as he holds his foot. The way music from each boss arena is remixed is also a nice touch. The last stage is unique to Zant, and if anything it's just funny how Zant attacks you with his crazy animations and warping ability. It's a nice way of conveying how Zant isn't all he's cracked up to be. It turns out he's a buffoonish character, who's only powerful because Ganon happened to house his power inside him. I appreciate it when the Zelda team pull out madcap moments like this that betray expectations. Majora's Mask Music Box House. Majora's Mask is a creepy and strange oddity of a game. Almost all of its locations are under a curse, including Ikana Canyon, which is one of the gloomiest locations. Re-Deads are wandering around, as is Sakon near his hideout, and some ghosts and other creatures are there too. One isolated bit of cheerfulness is the house at the centre of it all. When a watermill is powered up to play happy music, the Re-Deads disappear and a girl walks out to look around. You have to sneak around her to go inside the house. Interior locations in the overworld are usually safe places, containing no threat of combat. The first floor of this house seems innocent enough. The basement is darker but still empty of people at first. Then a coffin opens up and a freaky half-mummified man staggers towards you with a ghoulish cry. If you attack him, the girl comes back to throw you out. You're meant to play a song instead, which cures him of his curse. The father and daughter then embrace in sadness. It's not the most brilliant story in the world, but it's a memorable and strange encounter. I much prefer it when little bits of story are told in these unique ways of interaction, rather than watching cliché characters with overbite display tedious acts of heroism in overblown cutscenes. With better hardware over time, Nintendo have opted to include more and more cutscenes in Zelda. It seems when they had limited technology, they would come up with cleverer ways of making events play out. Ocarina of Time, Twin Rover. The Mirror Shield had already been put to good use earlier in the dungeon, but to use it in a boss battle was another great thing. Casting spells back at the witches looked really spectacular. It's not a difficult encounter, although it was still made a little bit trickier than it could have been otherwise. Z-targeting one of the witches alone isn't enough to counter them. You have to move around while Z-targeting or position the shield manually to more accurately reflect their magic back at them. The second stage is much easier, but it's still spectacular to see the shield glowing as it stores the magical spells 3 times. The sound effects also work really well. It's the kind of sensational imaginings you want to see from a fantasy. I'll say that the arena looks awesome too, especially as you enter it. You climb onto the middle platform and the area stretches out enormously around you. I already knew what the boss looked like beforehand, but to be thinking about how the fight might play out as I made my way forward was very exciting. The fact that the witches had their own fun theme tune was also pretty neat. Skyward Sword, Silent Realm. I don't usually like it in Zelda games when the main quest has you do drawn out events outside of dungeons. The Zelda team are good at designing puzzles inside dungeons, whereas sequences outside may be fairly enjoyable, but not nearly as considerable. I often just want to get to the next dungeon, but the game often makes you do tedious tasks before you get to it. I'd imagine I would replay Twilight Princess more often for its dungeons, if it wasn't for the opening, bug collecting and other events. Skyward Sword also had a lot of content in its main quest outside dungeons, but to its credit that content was actually pretty good. There were puzzle sequences in the overworld's desert region that were good enough to be worthy of their own dungeon. I also thought it was clever how the game redesigned areas that you would revisit. My favourite reuse of a location was the Silent Realm. Skyward Sword is a light-hearted game, so I was all the more surprised when it threw something creepy at me. Things seem peaceful and serene at first in the Silent Realm, but when you make your first steps outside the protective circle, nightmarish music plays and large blade-wielding enemies sprint towards you. I never wanted to leave that circle. I wasn't this intimidated by a Zelda game since I faced Dead Hand as a child in Ocarina of Time. But eventually I summoned my courage, and there were tense moments that made me realise I was right for being nervous. The loud sound that's made when the timer reaches 0 is mercilessly intimidating. There was one tense moment where the Guardians all woke up while I was slowly walking along a tightrope. But eventually I completed the Silent Realm and felt a huge sense of relief, at least until the next Silent Realm in another area. Breath of the Wild, blocking fire in Vah Rudania. Vah Rudania was the last divine beast for me, and it wasn't quite my favourite, but it was still great and it got me stuck longer than any of the others. I needed to open up a door to a small room. I could see into the room from outside, and I tried using the magnesis ability to move an object inside, hoping it would solve something. But eventually I figured out I needed to light a torch inside by shooting a flaming arrow through the door. That kind of made me kick myself a little, but it wasn't the cleverest part. When inside the small room I again got stuck. There were flames blocking the path to a terminal I needed to activate. For such a long time I wasn't seeing how a large metallic block could shield my path to the terminal from the flames. I tried so many ways to solve the issue, but eventually I remembered that you could rotate the whole divine beast onto its side, and then the huge block can shield off the flames when they are sideways. That really did make me kick myself. I applauded the game for being clever, and appreciated once again the game's decision to establish abilities and mechanics early on, and leave it up to the player to remember to use these abilities to figure out puzzles. Ocarina of Time, stealing the pond owner's hat. Apparently the fishing pond in Ocarina of Time was a pet project of one of the game's developers. He was supposed to be working on the main game, but kept working on an optional fishing minigame instead. This became a popular and oddly satisfying part of the game. The fishing mechanics aren't particularly deep, but they still work well and they're a neat distraction from the main quest. More importantly, the area has a memorable character and some interesting secrets. To this day I myself have never caught the mysterious Hylian Loach. The pond owner is a funny character with many quirks. Apparently he was based on someone real that the developer knew. He keeps scratching himself and he says seriously all the time. When you return to him after 7 years, he's one of the few characters who still recognises you, since it turns out you're his only customer. He has turned bald and tries hiding it with a hat, and the best part is that if you aim just right, you can hook his hat off with the fishing pole. You can give the hat back to him straight away, or you can continue fishing until the hat detaches and sinks into the pond. He'll then remain without his hat for the rest of the game, including during the game's end credits. It's great that the developers bothered to include fun content like this. A Link to the Past, block puzzle in the Ice Palace. Getting stuck in dungeons might be a love-hate relationship for a lot of Zelda fans. It can be frustrating looking around not knowing what to do, but sometimes a dungeon needs challenge to feel satisfying. Whether it can be appreciated depends on whether the puzzle was well thought out, and if you'll be kicking yourself after finding the solution. The dungeon in A Link to the Past that had me stuck the longest was the Ice Palace. I spent ages working out how to keep a switch held down in a room near to the boss. Ideas passed through my head, such as leading a stealth horse to stepping on it, or hoping the force of a blow from the hammer would keep it down. But eventually I figured out I had to drop a block from a floor above to use, but that wasn't all there was to it. Due to a system of switches, the block I needed to push down had to be accessed by navigating around the rest of the dungeon, just to reach the other side of the room. It was an impressive instance of the game structuring some kind of puzzle based on a large part of the dungeon's entire layout, rather than in just one room. It was frustrating to work out, but I appreciated it after it was over, and it made the game feel more satisfying overall. The Legend of Zelda, Wizrobes. The original Zelda game didn't integrate puzzle solving as much as later Zelda games. Instead, it focused much more on action and exploration. If Ocarina of Time is a 3D translation of A Link to the Past, then a 3D translation of the original Zelda might be something like Dark Souls. A Link to the Past retained a good amount of difficulty, but still didn't pack as much of a punch as its predecessor. The Wizrobes in the original game's 6th dungeon were especially difficult. That was where I died the most. The blue Wizrobes take multiple hits, shoot magical spells at you, vanish from sight, and warp across the room. 8-bit games like Zelda, Mario and Tetris on the NES felt like proper unadulterated gaming experiences. When playing the original Zelda, the gameplay felt classic to me the same way chess feels like a classic board game. The game's combat is pretty much chess turned into an action game. If Zelda enemies are like chess pieces, the Wizrobes would be the queen. Their difficulty level helps ensure that the game actually feels like an accomplishment once you complete it. Breath of the Wild, first photo location. I'm not sure why the photo location quest is listed as a main quest when it's entirely optional. Maybe the developers felt it was too good to be dismissed as a side quest. In any case, I really enjoyed the activity of finding the photo locations. The world was so large that locating them wasn't immediately obvious. You had to look at objects of interest in the photos to figure out where to go. Sometimes your only clue was the angle at which mountains on the horizon were photographed. My favourite photo location was the very first one I found near Kakariko Village. I immediately treated the process like a puzzle and tested whether I could guess the location from observing the overworld map. I was tipped off about its general location by the game's travelling painter, but still I had to pay particular attention to the map to notice formations in the layout and work out where it was located. I saw an area on the map where it looked like there might be a gate, just as there was in the photo. My guesswork paid off. The journey on the way to the location involved seeing some nice scenery and interesting early enemy encounters, but the satisfaction of coming across the photo location I thought was going to be there was immense. Ocarina of Time, first time inside the Spirit Temple. Entering the Spirit Temple wasn't great just because of the atmosphere and how it felt brilliant to come across yet another large dungeon late in the game. When exploring the first room, I found it strange to see things that you would normally interact with as a child. Then of course it dawned on me that the dungeon expected us to go back to being a child and re-enter. Perhaps not all players will feel this way, but I thought it was really exciting to go back in time and complete part of one of the last dungeons as a child, after I'd been so used to playing as adult Link for a long time. Earlier you had been required to play as a child again to complete the bottom of the well, but only as a child, and it didn't really feel like an adult dungeon. When you return to the Spirit Temple as a child, you take on Stalfos, Woolmasters, and an Iron Knuckle. You meet the adult Nabooru, who speaks down to you before becoming attracted to you when you return as an adult. Having the Spirit Temple be set up for Link as both child and adult mixed things up really nicely. Twilight Princess Dominion Rod. Zelda games typically feature a weapon some way into the main quest that gives you a lot of physical power, so you can smash stuff up in that item's dungeon. In A Link to the Past, I guess you could say there was the hammer, which wasn't actually all that spectacular in its power. In Ocarina of Time you got a hammer in the Fire Temple, and my favourite use of it is when you whack a giant pillar down to the room below, dropping with it as it falls, and creating a path to the boss room. The Wind Waker also had a hammer at the Forsaken Fortress, but then Twilight Princess went for something new. Maybe the ball and chain is its alternative to the hammer, and I love how you can use it to smash up furniture inside the mansion. But an even cooler item that works more like a hammer is the Dominion Rod. With it you get to control a large statue. It follows on from the Wind Waker's idea of possessing and moving around statues, but it's done quicker and cleverer, and it's more empowering. It's a neat touch how you would struggle past a series of obstacles in corridors leading up to the item, and then breeze past those obstacles on the way back, simply by smashing them all up with the statue's giant hammer. I'd imagine the only reason they placed a large number of such generic enemies inside some of the dungeon's rooms is because of how fun it is to wipe them all out with the new item. Almost everything is vulnerable to it, including Link himself if you're not too careful. It's one of those moments in games where you get a new item and you want to take it with you for as long as you can, like when you get a warthog in Halo and try to ride it into buildings, even though it's not intended. Its uses out in the overworld aren't as exciting, but its first uses inside its own dungeon made for a great moment. Majora's Mask: Alien Invasion. Majora's Mask's time cycle meant that events could be happening across its world, regardless of whether you were there to see it. You might come across the ranch when something terrible has already happened, and pain is consequently written on the face of the young girl living there. But if you visit the ranch on the first day, the girl will tell you they arrive at night. She's referring to the aliens that invade the ranch to steal the cows inside the barn. It all sounds very silly in typical Nintendo fashion, but it's executed in a way that still manages to be creepy. I think it would have been even more unsettling had they not established what the aliens looked like in a cutscene. Still, when you're left alone at the ranch outside at night to wait for the aliens to arrive over the hill, it can feel intimidating. Some aliens sneak around the back of the barn you're trying to protect, and it's easy to run out of arrows if you don't begin with many. I've seen on YouTube that if you fail, the girl gets abducted alongside the cows. She appears in the ranch the next day with a dreadful expression on her face. I've never triggered the failed cutscene myself, although there was one very tense moment when I had lost track of the time and only just about made it to the ranch to shoot the aliens seconds before they reached the barn. The gameplay during the moment isn't exactly amazing, but the way it unfolds in real time with the time cycle makes it very memorable. Breath of the Wild: Flying into a Cave Shrine. It was very easy to spot one particular shrine in the snowy Hebra region of Breath of the Wild, but it was very difficult for me to locate the path to get inside it. You can view the shrine through an impassable crack in a wall. I kept trying to think of ways I could get through the crack or blow it open. Nothing seemed to be working. Hearing the ethereal music associated with cave shrines in this area made wanting to get into the shrine all the more enticing. I spent ages exploring the area, wondering if there was a tunnel leading to it from another location. I left figuring out how to get to it to play the rest of the game for many hours before coming back. I felt so resigned by it that I got as close as you could get to looking up an online guide. But once more I tried exploring the surrounding area for possible answers. I travelled by raft on the nearby lake and found boulders I could break apart with bombs. They revealed upward gusts of wind, which I used to lift myself high into the air with the paraglider. And then I saw it. Some burning torches illuminated a cave entrance high up on a cliff, previously out of sight. I glided over there and got inside. After a short journey through the cave, I eventually emerged in front of the shrine that I had wanted to get to for so long. Some annoying overworld enemies were placed there unnecessarily, but still the moment felt great. There are other shrines I wouldn't blame people for looking up an online guide to get to, but this was one where I was so glad that I didn't. The sense of discovery was fantastic. Ocarina of Time: Volvagia. Before playing Ocarina of Time, I remember seeing a compilation of 1-second clips from the game on the UK TV show Games Master. One clip of Volvagia flying inside a volcano caught my imagination the most. The idea of a fantasy video game featuring a dragon might always be exciting, but for a AAA game from a well-respected series to do it in the early days of 3D gaming was especially exciting. You're told that the boss of the Fire Temple is a dragon before you even get there, and it's pretty exciting knowing that's what you're eventually going to fight as you make your way through the dungeon. When you get to the boss room, the atmosphere doesn't disappoint, with the unremitting dark red colours and the sound of boiling lava, conveying the sense that you're right at the heart of the volcano. The actual fight involves using the dungeon's hammer to strike the boss when it emerges from any one of the lava holes, turning it into a kind of whack-a-mole, which sounds silly, but it doesn't stop it from looking epic. The boss deals out a lot of damage, so getting near it feels dangerous. I appreciate that the Zelda team put a distinctive spin on the design of Volvagia. It could have looked like most European-style dragons, like you see in Skyrim, a design that I think is hard to fit around a satisfying set of game mechanics. But Volvagia was made to look more like a Chinese dragon with its snake-like appearance. Just the sight of it as it flies through the air and breathes columns of fire made for a great highlight. Skyward Sword: Final Girahim Boss Battle. The boss battle with Girahim in the first dungeon was a frustrating encounter, because it took me a while to figure out what I had to do exactly. He'll block your sword attack with his held out hand, unless you direct his hand to one side before moving your sword to the other and attacking. It's not obvious that this is what the game expects you to do, and if you move your sword to the other side too quickly, the game will register it as a sword swipe. It was strange, but it made some sense. Maybe most Zelda fans don't expect the game to require that much thought in a boss battle. The second fight with Girahim in the Fire Sanctuary was less frustrating, and so it was more enjoyable, but the best fight with him was the last one near the end of the game. Many have complained about the motion controls, but I'm one of the players where they work just fine. The combat is often much more involved and exciting than it was in previous games. I also enjoyed the way you knocked Girahim off the arena platforms in different stages. The fight with Demise afterwards was also fun and spectacular, but I preferred the one with Girahim. Another thing I like about the character is his amusing personality. He's meant to act like an egocentric creep, but his quirky voice acting is pretty funny at times. It was a shame the Fire Sanctuary didn't have a unique boss, but fighting Girahim at least twice, near the start and end of the game, was very satisfying. Breath of the Wild, tilting Var Meadow. Zelda games could be accused of being a jack-of-all-trades, master of none, in that it mixes many genres, such as racing and shooting and stealth, but never executes them in as much depth as other games that would focus on just one of those genres. You could argue that bringing them together in one huge action-adventure game makes for an exciting adventure overall, with much-needed variation to keep things interesting, but in any case I think one aspect the Zelda team does master is dungeon design. Despite that Breath of the Wild was Nintendo's best attempt at making a fun overworld, I still felt like the game was at its best and most impressive inside the Divine Beasts, so it was a shame to me that there were only 4 of them, and no other proper dungeons, but what we still got was still really good. Tilting the whole of Var Meadow while wandering around and solving puzzles was amazing. It proved again that Nintendo doesn't need a new gimmick in console technology to innovate and come up with awe-inspiring puzzle ideas. It's not my favourite of the Divine Beasts, but the music was exciting, as was its combination of gameplay mechanics, including the use of wind, the game's new physics engine, and the rune abilities. Simply being on board the Divine Beast after seeing it far away in the sky for so long was a great feeling. Ocarina of Time, Phantom Ganon. The Zelda series is great not just because they're very well polished, but because the ideas they contain are brilliantly imaginative. It takes creative minds to come up with a lot of what you see in Zelda dungeons. The boss of the Forest Temple is a good example of this. He's a phantom who rides a flying dark horse into and out of surrounding landscape paintings, while casting bolts of lightning down at you. They made the effect happen by squashing the boss into an almost two-dimensional model when he gets near a painting, and then moving that model vertically so that it looks like he's inside the painting and travelling up the path towards the castle. Not just anyone can come up with this kind of creative imagery in developing a game, but that's the kind of standard Ocarina of Time was delivering upon. Again, the act of entering the boss arena and initiating the battle is extended for dramatic effect. You're free to observe the paintings in the room and wonder about what exactly is about to go down. It's not until you try to exit that the place becomes locked and the boss reveals itself. It's quite a shock to see what looks like the main villain, conveying the sense that you've walked in on the end of the game. The idea behind the battle's first section fits in nicely with the dungeon's theme of haunting spirits and elusive trickery. Similar to one of the Poe fights, Phantom Ganon duplicates himself to throw you off guard. The real version can be identified by how it makes the sound of footsteps, whereas the fake one doesn't. In the second stage of the fight, the boss gets off his horse and shoots a spell that can be cast back at him with your sword, a style of battle that has appeared in every Zelda game since it was introduced in A Link to the Past. As good as it is, I'd have preferred it if subsequent Zelda games had reimagined the first part of the Phantom Ganon battle instead, since that's most of what made this moment so awe-inspiring to me. Breath of the Wild, Monk Maz Koshia. I was disappointed that there weren't more Divine Beasts or other dungeons in Breath of the Wild, so to get another Divine Beast in the DLC was very welcome. It was probably my least favourite in terms of level design, but the boss was the real highlight. It felt a whole lot more unique than any of the Blight Ganon variations. I liked how the DLC played around with the expectations built up from having played the base game. In shrines you would typically complete a few puzzles or fight an enemy before being given a reward from a statue like Monk. Shrines in the DLC mixed things up by having you explore further down inside them, or changing the aesthetic. But the best surprise is when you discover the Monk at the end of the DLC's Divine Beast. It did cross my mind that this monk might turn out to be a boss, but I still felt pleasantly surprised when the monk stirred to life and stood up. The fight is not completely unique because it brings back ideas from the Yiga enemies and Thunderblight Ganon, but it stitches them together to create a wonderfully exciting battle. The presentation is really good, and there's a neat detail in that you can distract the boss temporarily by dropping him some mighty bananas that he likes to eat. But the best moment is definitely when the monk stands up and the cool boss music starts playing. For some reason I never skipped those cutscenes when monks talk slowly at the end of shrines. Now it felt like it was all a setup for this awesome reveal in the DLC. Ocarina of Time, Escaping Lon Lon Ranch. You don't need Epona at all to complete Ocarina of Time, but it's one of the first things you're likely to do after the 7-year time shift. First of all, it's neat how you can tame Epona by playing the song she likes that you learned as a child, and then the events that follow with the ranch owner are even better. If you win 2 races against Ingo, you get to keep the horse. The carrot system that works like a stamina meter was important in providing extra interactivity to make the riding controls less flat and uneventful. You have to time whipping Epona close enough to a fence so that you can jump over it with the speed boost. This fits very neatly and satisfyingly into the conclusive part of the sequence. Ingo gets so annoyed at losing the race that he shuts the ranch's gate. You get to keep Epona, but you're locked inside. That is until you figure out that you can escape the ranch by having Epona jump over the gate or surrounding fences. The simple but heroic cutscene enhances the feeling of triumph, and then you're free to travel across Hyrule on your newly won steed. Again, Epona is entirely optional, but it's a more than welcome addition, and the sight of Link with a horse has become an iconic image in the series. Breath of the Wild, Tarry Town Wedding. Breath of the Wild's overworld really needed to impress me with some good content after I found out its main quest only featured 4 divine beasts and no other proper dungeons. Tarry Town greatly helped in this regard. The manner in which it starts is disarmingly peculiar. I think part of what makes it work is the wonderfully soothing music. It sounded like a piece I'd heard from somewhere else before, but I still can't think of what that might be. Maybe it's Breath of the Wild's own version of the usual Kakariko Village theme, with the opening being inverted, and I can recognise a passage lifted from the Wind Waker's Windfall Island theme in the middle. In any case, when I heard the Tarry Town theme play as Hudson walked off into the distance, it felt odd but very intriguing. Before the side quest had been initiated, I remember exploring the large rock island in Ikala shortly after completing the main quest. I complained about how it contained just another goddess statue and nothing else of interest. I was beginning to feel that the game wasn't offering up enough content to adequately fill its large world. But the Tarry Town side quest went some way to proving me wrong. Finding characters from different regions of the overworld to help construct and populate the new town felt like really fun progression. It's a bit like the trading side quest from Ocarina of Time in that it's mostly a fetch quest, but the execution is a lot more elaborate and satisfying. Tarry Town becomes quite a beautiful place to look at, and the music builds with each new character adding a different instrument to the mix. None of the characterization on display here is particularly noteworthy, but just the progression of the side quest makes the overworld feel a little more eventful and less static than it would have been otherwise. Majora's Mask, Anju and Kafai's side quest. I loved Majora's Mask's time cycle concept. A Link to the Past introduced the idea of parallel worlds, mixing things up between 2 overworlds. Ocarina of Time included something similar, but made it about the passing of time instead, by shifting the player between a younger and older world, and it included a day and night cycle too. Majora's Mask went further and included 3 different days and nights, changing the world in ways as time passed on. The Zelda team made sure to include a side quest that stretched from the first day all the way to the last night. Whenever you go back to the first day, one of the first things you'll see is Kafai delivering a letter to the mailbox. His purple clothes will catch your eye, and he runs away mysteriously. For a long time you won't know what to do with him, but eventually you get to know characters and unravel the mystery. Overall, the quest is not the best of stories, but it's still more than run-of-the-mill. And just the act of carrying out this quest in a world that felt considerably well realised was an absorbing experience. The quest involves different events and characters and locations. Watching the postman picking up a letter you put in the mailbox is exciting. Eventually getting into areas that were previously blocked is exciting. Hiding with Kafei and waiting for some event to occur nearby is exciting. Getting to the end of such a long quest is exciting. The bit of gameplay inside Sakun's hideout is a surprisingly strange yet fun event, and if you fail it, the game leaves you in an eerie moment of silence that feels haunting. But maybe the best moment is the conclusion. Andrew and Kafei reunite just at the last moment before the moon falls. It's chilling seeing them both look at you as the whole place is shaking. Unsettling music is playing, the timer is reaching towards 0, and everything is about to be burnt to ash. You have to go back in time if you don't want to see the characters get crushed to smithereens. Once you do, you'll again see Kafei delivering a letter on the first day, since everything you completed has been undone. But now you know the full mystery behind that quest. The Wind Waker. Final battle with Ganondorf. The Wind Waker reversed the order of the final boss battles from Ocarina of Time. It worked well in Ocarina of Time to fight Ganondorf in human form, and then to be surprised by an extra battle with Ganon in beast form, but it was good that the Wind Waker didn't simply repeat that. The fight with Puppet Ganon, which is comparable to beast form, was fun, but the fight with Ganondorf felt like a more satisfying end. The visuals of the arena were impressive, with water cascading down to drown out Hyrule. The music also worked really well. The gameplay isn't challenging, but it's still a bit trickier to land hits on Ganondorf than on other enemies in the game. I like how Ganondorf walks slowly, not because he's weighed down by heavy armor, but just because he's overconfident. He'll fly towards you and pull out quick moves when he wants to. My favourite animation is the one where he blocks an attack behind him with his sword. It's pretty nice to be playing alongside Zelda, rather than just relegating her to cutscenes completely. And another great part of this battle to cap it off is stabbing Ganondorf right in the head. Ganon in his beast form was grimly stabbed in the face in Ocarina of Time, but if anything it's more brutal to see him meet this demise while in human form. He's even alive for a while and speaks as the sword is buried in his forehead. It would have looked too disturbing if the graphics were more real, yet it's still quite surprising to see it in a cartoonish game. Majora's Mask, Ikana Castle boss battle. One of my least liked areas in Majora's Mask was Beneath the Well, which was just an annoying fetch quest that failed to come up with its own impressive ideas. But once you're out of that well, the glorious music of Ikana Castle plays, and the game gets back into its stride. The best part about the castle is the boss battle with the 3 Stalfos enemies. The smaller of the two play out much like they do in Ocarina of Time, but they must be destroyed by reflecting light onto them. One of my friends suggested that I shoot a fire arrow at the room's curtains, which was something I didn't think the game would expect you to do. But when I tried it, I was pleasantly surprised to see the curtains burn and let sunlight inside. The fight with the largest Stalfos enemy is much harder, and one of his moves is unfair in that it's impossible to avoid taking damage from it. But it can be fun fighting him and making him cower by reflecting light at his bones. However, the most fun is had by discovering some of the fight's amusing secrets. If you run up to the largest Stalfos enemy while he is sat at his throne, he will simply punt you away, sending you flying through the air. Another thing you can do is wear a mask made to look like a Stalfos king, which will initiate a cutscene in which you're temporarily mistaken for their leader. But the best and most bizarre secret in this battle happens if you wear another mask that lets you march while playing a catchy tune. The 2 littler Stalfos enemies will pause and look at each other briefly before joining in with the march, as if they can't help themselves but to play along. I often think Majora's Mask is the best Zelda game when it comes to secrets. It's a delightful aspect of the game, yet obviously overlooked because of how well hidden and obscure the details are. Breath of the Wild, Blood Moon. The first time the Blood Moon happened for me was when I was inside Kakariko Village. I wrongly assumed that it was an event triggered from having finished talking to Impa, and it didn't seem too eventful at the time, so I quickly forgot about it. But then on my second day of playing the game, I was running across Hyrule Field at night completely lost. The low register and discordant pieces of piano music had already put me on edge. I didn't know what I might be running into in the wilderness. I was paying close attention to the environment, since the landmarks in the surroundings were breathtaking. Then when I turned the camera and discovered the blood moon high in the night sky, I instantly stood still in shock. It looked so mysterious and ominous. I eventually continued to travel forwards, not knowing what the moon was about. Then strange music started to play, and colours in the environment were changing. The high register passage from the wind instrument sounded like something from a scary cartoon. Worried thoughts were going through my mind. I kept looking above as if a UFO was about to appear. Since I was somewhat close to Hyrule Castle, I thought that maybe Ganon had spotted my presence and was coming after me. After a while, a cutscene played to establish that enemies I had killed in the overworld had now regenerated, so the payoff wasn't really satisfying, but just the build-up of the moment through its presentation was incredible. I enjoyed it every time it happened afterwards too, stopping to gaze at the moon and take in the unsettling atmosphere. It felt like something out of Majora's Mask, just an oddly creepy event that I didn't expect. The Legend of Zelda, getting far and wide. Zelda games can have such long quests and giant overworlds that it feels like you've travelled far and wide when you reach some later part of the game. In Ocarina of Time I felt this when I got through not just the Gerudo Valley, but all the way through the Haunted Wasteland to the Desert Colossus, where the Spirit Temple was located. I felt like a genuine adventurer when I reached it. Discovering ancient ruins and a large new dungeon was great. Breath of the Wild also makes you feel like you've travelled far and wide on account of its massive overworld. I remember trekking through the outskirts of the Hebra region all the way to the top left corner of the map. It felt great how much distance I had covered, and it was still going on. Looking back at the rest of the world and seeing it so far behind was amazing. But this experience of exploration managed to be achieved really well even in the original 8-bit Zelda game. The overworld was pretty huge and intimidating, especially when playing it for the first time. Journeying out felt like a daunting task, because I wasn't sure where I was going and whether I had enough health or experience to make it all the way. Getting through the Lost Woods and into the dark eastern regions containing Lynels made me feel like I had travelled far and wide. There was a graveyard too, and next to that was one of the game's hardest dungeons. Finding any dungeon in this game's overworld felt like a wonderful triumph, and getting through the dungeon was another perilous task of its own. So while other Zelda games provided such a large world that made you travel far and wide, I'll give this spot in the list to the original because it was the first to do it and it did it really well. Ocarina of Time, Dark Link. Dungeons usually leave a lasting impression through their atmosphere, the dungeon's items and the main boss. The mini-boss is usually forgotten. I liked how Morpha formed giant tentacles out of water, which would grab you, choke you in the air for a while, and toss you across the room. Yet this main boss is completely upstaged by the dungeon's mini-boss, Dark Link. He might seem better suited to the Shadow Temple, but I think he works really well in the Water Temple. His vaporous arena is completely unique and surreal. The lone tree and ethereal surroundings are very striking and unexpected. When you enter and walk forward, you can see your reflection in the shallow water. Eventually that reflection vanishes, and that's when Dark Link appears, as though he formed himself out of that reflection. It's unsettling to notice him by the tree, watching you in silence. He appears like a mirage. Approaching him will suddenly initiate the fight, with the surprise shock of the battle music. The soft patters of his feet on the shallow water is a neat effect. His voice being the same as adult Link's but deeper is unnerving. If you Z-target and try to stab him, he'll momentarily leap up and stand on your sword like a ninja, and he'll look down as though he's mocking you. His health bar reflects your own, so if you have a lot of hearts, the battle will ironically be harder. He mirrors your sword attacks, which makes for a unique and puzzling encounter, but he'll also do separate moves such as a backflip when you use a spin attack. Using Din's Fire or the Megaton Hammer constantly can make him easier, but the battle is more exciting if it's purely a sword fight, and it often leaves me low on hearts. There's a more complicated technique of defeating him with just the Master Sword, as hitting back his sword will eventually leave an opening for one more strike towards his body. As the fight progresses, his body solidifies, his red eyes grow more prominent, and his aggression increases. When he is defeated, the surroundings turn to normal, as though a spell has been lifted. This was such a great mini-boss that it was better than most main bosses in the entire Zelda series. Majora's Mask, Gaiorg. The Great Bay Temple was an intimidating labyrinth of sensational dungeon design. It took me a really long time to get through it all as a child. I never once whined, but simply persevered until finally I was nearing the boss room. There was one last brief puzzle to complete at the end, right in front of the boss room door, drawing out the suspense. I was as immersed in this dungeon as I'd been in any game, and the boss fight didn't relent but doubled down on this experience. It was a ferocious, shark-like creature that I very quickly died to. The battle uses the Zora abilities very effectively. It's tense how it makes you get into the water with the boss. The way they placed bottles for when you run out of magic at the corners of the room underwater is very devious. The part that really makes the battle exciting is each time you try to get back onto the platform, not knowing how close the boss is behind you. It often made me jump whenever the boss grabbed me just before I climbed up. Maybe I would have defeated the boss sooner had I collected more pieces of hearts from the overworld, but I still used fairies to resurrect myself in the fight. It was simply a matter of learning the mechanics of the game and applying myself properly. The key move is to dolphin flip out of the water and onto the platform above. A lot of Zelda fans complain about Gyorg and the Great Bay Temple overall, but I can't sympathise with them. I'm sure I found it just as challenging as anyone, but this is something I came to appreciate rather than whine about. Breath of the Wild, Snowball Shrine. I didn't find anything particularly exciting when exploring the Hebra region in Breath of the Wild for the first time, so when I later decided to go back there, I wasn't confident I would come across much of interest. But eventually I realised I had simply taken a bad path and missed some of the overworld's best content. In the end, it was here that I discovered my favourite moment in the whole of the game's overworld. I came across a large snowy slope that was ridged in a way that looked distinctive yet natural. I assumed it was just another area to let you snowboard on the shield if you wanted to. I did this just as I had done in many other places, and I wasn't particularly excited by it. But then I saw a shrine blocked by a massive door inside a cave near the bottom of the slope. I experimented with lots of abilities to try and open the door, but nothing was working. I felt resigned and decided to explore the surrounding area. I went so far back up the slope that I was sure I was too far away to solve anything to do with the shrine. I found some snowballs and found it pretty neat how they'll get bigger as they accumulated more snow when you send them rolling down the large slope. Then I re-examined the ridges in the slope and thought that maybe it was an elaborate puzzle connected to the shrine. I rolled many snowballs down the slope, wondering about which pathway between the ridges would best lead to the shrine. Eventually I chose the correct one and hovered down using the paraglider while the snowball rolled its way down and became huge before smashing the door open at the bottom. The shrine inside the cave didn't offer any more content, but it didn't need to, since getting to it already made for a delightful moment. The snowball puzzle put the game's physics engine to great use, and figuring it out felt natural and really put a smile on my face. Ocarina of Time, completing the Water Temple. The Water Temple was a deliberately challenging instance of level design. The cutscene that comes after it where the lake refills is nice, but I think what most people take from it is just the fact that it came after such a long dungeon. Many players will simply be glad it's over and not want to see anything like it ever again, while others like myself will appreciate the challenge it brought forth. The dungeon has a changing layout as you raise and lower levels of water inside. It spans out in 4 different directions on 3 floors. There are 2 difficult spots that you access after raising the water to the 2nd level, one at the very bottom room, and 2 behind a wall you can blow up on the 2nd floor. They can be called frustrating, but so can anything that's challenging. It's not like they're unfair. You know you have to locate keys, and you can do so by looking at your map and thinking about how to get to where they are. I guess if people just explore with an absent mind, hoping they'll stumble across wherever they need to go eventually, they must be too used to linear design and hand-holding. Maybe there was another part that was a little unfair. I didn't realise there was a passageway behind the chest containing the long shot in the room after you fight Dark Link. Navi points it out by hovering there and turning green. Either I still didn't notice it, or maybe I did but assumed it wasn't important, and eagerly ran back to the rest of the dungeon to see what I could do with the long shot. After a while I saw there was only one room in the dungeon containing a key I hadn't been to. I spent ages returning to a room with rotating water and a dragon statue at the bottom, since there was a passageway near the ceiling leading to that key, but it was always out of reach. Possibly I could have worked out that the only other way of reaching the room containing that key was by dropping into it from another room, which of course is what you do. That passageway near the ceiling in the room with the dragon statue turned out to be an exit to the room containing the last key, which I thought was amusing. It all came full circle in the end. The dungeon is full of cool puzzle moments that make use of the hookshot. Having to go to the menu screen to select the iron boots is a bit of a nuisance, but going through a dungeon by diving underwater and resurfacing in other areas adds a great sense of exploration. I think some rooms in the Water Temple are where the game's visuals look their best. Comparing the dungeon's boss room to any of the rooms inside A Link to the Past Swamp Palace goes to show what a huge difference the transition to 3D made. Its walls are shimmering as though light is bouncing from the surface of moving water. I like how the water in the boss room is different to that of the more natural looking water elsewhere in the game. The dungeon's soundtrack conveys the idea of huge water contraptions at work, with mills and other water-based mechanics in motion, and sounds that spill into one another like buckets of water tipping over and glistening. Link's voice echoes in these areas just like it would in a dungeon filled with water, making it feel all the more three-dimensional and authentic. I've gone into some depth here, but it's important not to ignore that these dungeons come to feel greater than the sum of their parts when they're finished. And I definitely felt this way about the Water Temple. It was a tough dungeon, but it was worthwhile, and it made Link look all the more heroic in the cutscene after when he warps down from the sky. Twilight Princess, Midna's Desperate Hour. I really don't like the majority of characters in Twilight Princess, nor the many cutscenes that dwell upon them so much, but at least Midna always stood out as a good character, with some interesting moments and a properly developed story. She possesses the same churlish personality of previous female characters in the series, such as Ruto, Tattle and Tetra, but she's all the more boisterous and playful, and she's given a lot more dialogue and screen time. At the start, when Link has been transformed into an animal and is chained up inside a prison, she teases him and bosses him around. She is from a different world, and at first cares little for the people in Link's world. But while following Link around in his adventure, she gradually takes a shine to him and respects his world. The final cutscene with her is nice, and offers quite a surprise in the reveal of her true form, but I think the moment everyone remembers the most is right after the Lakebed Temple. Midna has been mortally wounded by Zant, and we have to carry her on our back while frantically searching through the world for help. Usually while travelling around as Wolf Link, we would hear her perky groans and cries, but those have been silenced and replaced by her heavy breathing, reminding us of her impending death. We feel like we're losing a companion who we've become attached to over the course of the game. But the best thing about this moment that really makes it shine is the music. The piece is arranged for a piano and accompanying strings. The pianist's left hand plays arpeggios in a low register, while the right hand plays Midna's theme sparsely and mournfully. The strings eventually enter with sustained notes to enhance the tragic mood. As we travel through the Hyrule Market, the townspeople cower away from us, frightened by the sight of a dark wolf. It makes things feel all the more helpless, and puts us in Midna's position as a dark figure from a strange otherworld. It's one of those moments where it doesn't need much in the way of gameplay, such as puzzles and enemy encounters. Just the act of walking or running forward is enough in such an immersive scenario. Although there are some moments that infringe upon the drama, you meet a character whose buffoonish dilemma is at odds with the serious nature of the scene. You're also likely to come across overworld enemies while out in the field, and the out-of-place battle music interrupts the dramatic music, but it still doesn't spoil the moment overall. When Princess Zelda is finally reached, Midna asks her to help Link rather than herself, even though she is about to die. It's at this point that we can clearly see how Midna has transformed from a seemingly troublesome and selfish character into a heroic being who's compassionate to others. She is one of the most enigmatic characters in the series, and probably the best partner to ever accompany Link. A Link to the Past, Entering the Dark World. I'd imagine this would be higher up on the list for anyone who played the game in 1991. For me it wasn't such a dramatic moment, but it was still really good. You've been through the light world and defeated some dungeons, but then you're placed into a parallel world with even more dungeons. Maybe it's comparable to starting the second quest in the original 2D Zelda game, but I like how it's part of a single quest and storyline. There are new deadlier enemies, including giants that throw bombs. The colour palette is completely different. The layout is very similar, but still different in ways. The ability to transfer between the two worlds is really cool, and I really like the sound effect when you do so. But the best thing about entering the Dark World is the music. To create a theme that stands up so well to the classic Zelda theme used in the Light World is a great achievement. A moment like this works very well in keeping the player interested in the rest of the game. The Wind Waker, sailing across the overworld. Sailing in the Wind Waker was a double-edged sword. It was great for a fairly long while, but can easily become tiresome. Covering the overworld in a large sea was an exciting idea, but it did make the world fairly flat and monotonous. Breath of the Wild would do a much better job of making its overworld varied with distinct landscapes. Even Ocarina of Time did this. Its Hyrule field was sloped in ways to prevent it from looking like a generic field, but also its many other areas in its overworld twisted and turned in distinct ways. However, it still is a highlight that draws out a delightful sense of adventure. The first time you do it is when you leave Windfall with your newly acquired sail to get to Dragon Roost Island. The sight of the sea is wonderfully rendered in cel-shaded graphics. The overworld music is lovely and exciting. The weather effects do help to make the sea look more varied during some moments. Seeing a new island appear on the horizon and making your way to it always created an enticing feeling, and the seamlessness of the experience was fantastic. Breath of the Wild, activating Var Naboris. Var Naboris was my first divine beast, and it really started to make the game feel sensational when it allowed me to rotate the large inner chambers of the dungeon. It puts the game's physics to good use and made the dungeon feel alive. The mechanic brought forth some great moments of puzzle solving and exploration. You have to go into the menu to make the chambers rotate, but it all satisfyingly plays out in real time once selected. This, in combination with using the paraglider when you get dragged up high and need to float to a platform created below, is wonderful. I also like the groaning cry that the Divine Beast makes every time you shift it around. It's sensational game design that feels baffling and grand in scale. I enjoyed everything the reviewers praised about Breath of the Wild's overworld, but the Divine Beasts were where I found the game to be the most awe-inspiring. Ocarina of Time End Credits. Ocarina of Time was a Zelda game that got the ending cutscenes done very satisfyingly. It was surprising how much Breath of the Wild fell short with its ending in comparison. Maybe it's because cutscenes in modern games cost a lot more time and money to make. Breath of the Wild only had a brief cutscene with Zelda and some rolling credits. Ocarina of Time had so much more. The tone was brilliant too. I really appreciate how the game stays dark and gritty in the final dungeons, especially inside Ganon's castle, all the way up to when you defeat the final boss. This makes it satisfying when the ending cutscenes show off the brightness of Hyrule after. The scene with adult Link and Zelda at the end is actually set in Hyrule Field, but only shows the bright blue of the sky in the background. Zelda's lullaby in the soundtrack is given a richer texture with a fuller orchestra, reflecting the developed and more serious mood. Then to hear the piece played on a solo ocarina by Zelda creates a bittersweet moment that beckons the sense of childhood and Hyrule's earlier timeline. After that, we're shown the locations we visited throughout the game, which made me remember the times I had exploring them. It can be emotional, not only because it draws out nostalgia, but because I realised the experience was coming to an end. A large party is had in the ranch with all of the overworld characters, and it feels like a proper celebration. There's also a nice contrast of tone, with some characters mourning the loss of loved ones, who became sages overlooking Hyrule. The shot of Link walking away from the pedestal after returning the Master Sword is satisfyingly epic with heroic music and imagery, but the cutscene that follows is more affecting. Link and Zelda simply look at each other without saying a word. Zelda's lullaby in the soundtrack concludes on a somber note, as the end is displayed. It can feel heart-stopping to see such an epic game come to a close. Majora's Mask, Ice Arrows. I saw Majora's Mask as a continuation of Ocarina of Time's creative brilliance. It's as if there were a lot of ideas left over from Ocarina of Time, which were then used in Majora's Mask, such as the ice arrows. They had very little use in Ocarina of Time, but they're used brilliantly in Majora's Mask. You use them to freeze enemies, which then act as solid objects you can move and stand upon. An ice arrow on a mini-boss will freeze it and send it smashing down to the floor in an impressive bit of animation for the N64. You can make stepping stones anywhere on the surface of water for you to then jump onto and access otherwise out of reach areas. You can freeze waterfalls to gain access to ladders and stop water mills turning so that new paths throughout the dungeon are opened up. The fire arrows are complementary to the ice arrows in that you can use them to unfreeze those same objects should it be necessary. I think Majora's Mask's approach to item and ability progression worked really well. The mask transformations and items from the overworld gave abilities before entering dungeons, somewhat like Breath of the Wild giving you all abilities early on, and it's up to you to think to use them to solve puzzles. But it's still nice to get a dungeon item, and the magical arrows delivered on that in Majora's Mask, none more so than the ice arrow. Twilight Princess, the Spinner. Twilight Princess didn't feel like any kind of radical departure for the series like other Zelda games did, but I think it attempted to do new things inside dungeons more generally than the Wind Waker. A lot of its ideas in dungeons created some really fun highlights. I feel Twilight Princess properly gets going after the third dungeon, and the game really does feel like it's in full swing when you're inside the Arbiter's grounds. Getting the spinner item near the end made it particularly memorable. It's not like its mechanics are anywhere as deep as any dedicated skateboarding game, but its inclusion in the middle of a large action-adventure game felt really exciting and refreshing. The Stalord boss battle is a great way to finish off the dungeon. It's a fun encounter that makes simple use of the spinner item in 2 different stages. Overall, it might feel like the item was put to use only briefly. It's a shame the item wasn't used more thoroughly in the game overall, like Breath of the Wild might have done, but it's still enough to make a very fun highlight. Skyward Sword, Time Shift Stones. I like that Skyward Sword thoroughly integrated new ideas much more than the Wind Waker and Twilight Princess. Its motion controls helped it feel like more of a game changer. Recurring enemies always had a new spin on them, rather than merely being given minor tweaks and a visual overhaul. In the 5 years after Twilight Princess, it had felt like Valve were outdoing the Zelda team in creating brilliant puzzles with its Portal series. But Nintendo came back and showed that they were just as capable, especially with its imaginative use of the Time Shift Stones. The Zelda series had established the idea of switching between parallel worlds or different time states before, but Skyward Sword took this idea further by having the environment change through time states dynamically in real time. It's awe-inspiring to see it unfold each time. At first you activate stationary stones, then you activate moving stones, which change the environment around them as they go along, and eventually you pick up your own stone and change the environment wherever you want. Another stone later on changes the whole of a dungeon whenever you strike it with an arrow. It makes for some complicated level design, as you need to activate the stone from different areas to successfully navigate through the dungeon. I also like how an environment's soundtrack will change depending on the time state, especially in the mining facility. Skyward Sword's desert region provided the best moments of gameplay, even outside of dungeons, and it was because of its use of the brilliant time shift stones. Breath of the Wild, going into Hyrule Castle. Getting through Hyrule Castle in Breath of the Wild was far from a perfect moment, because making my way to the top of it was made too easy and brief by how you could just swim up the waterfalls with the Zora armor. But it deserves a high spot in this list due to how amazing the atmosphere was. I wasn't completely set on going into Hyrule Castle when I finally did so. I was exploring the overworld and found myself close to one of those colossal plinths surrounding the castle. I was hoping that attempting to defeat Ganon, as the quest menu put it, would actually be a midway point that would lead to more dungeons, like it often does in other Zelda games. Maybe had I known for sure it was the end of the main quest and led to the credits, I might have held it off for longer and completed more side quests beforehand, but the lure of Hyrule Castle's setting was too strong. Its atmosphere made me feel like I was entering Mordor in Middle-earth. The Hyrule Castle town was completely decimated and in ruins. The place was crawling with guardians. It felt like any sign of my presence might wake the whole place up and bring upon me all forces of evil. My progression varied between slow sneaking and brief bursts of rushing through. The visuals were really good, but the best thing about it was the music. They could have rearranged the Hyrule Castle theme yet again like the Wind Waker and Twilight Princess did, but I'm so glad they went with something different instead. Part of it is actually the Ballad of the Windfish from Link's Awakening, but made to sound completely heroic and epic. This is cleverly overtaken by Ganon's theme, adding a sense of foreboding. Zelda's Lullaby also features whenever you're inside an interior. I'm usually not a fan of how medleys try to shoehorn familiar themes together one after the other, but here it worked wonderfully. At this point in the game I still wasn't completely set on facing Ganon, but in the end it was the music that convinced me to go all the way. I decided to explore Hyrule Castle in more depth when visiting it a second time. It's a shame it doesn't offer its own unique puzzles or enemies, but just as an area to rush through, it was pretty exciting. Majora's Mask, Going to the Moon. Majora's Mask was a really strange experience, but a brilliant one. Right after I defeated Twin Mold in the last dungeon, I went to face the Skull Kid at the clock tower, partly because I didn't realise new things opened up once you defeated the area's dungeon, but mainly because I was excited to see the final parts of the game. It certainly didn't disappoint. The giants stop the moon from falling and everything seems to be okay at first, but then the game gets even weirder. The Skull Kid appears to be floating in the air, but then detaches from the mask he was wearing and falls limp on the floor. The Majora's Mask itself remains in the air and starts to speak some threatening words. It gets beamed up into the mouth of the moon, then the moon also speaks threatening words as its eyes suddenly light up. It's all really unexpected and quirky, but dramatic and spine-chilling. You soon get beamed up into the moon too, and suddenly you're in an entirely new area. It's surprisingly peaceful inside the moon. There's a large green field with one huge tree at the centre. It feels as surreal as Dark Link's area from Ocarina of Time. There's no music, just eerie quietness and birds chirping. It's a small calm before the storm, leading up to the final boss battle. Sometimes Nintendo surprises players with beautiful environments such as this. It happened at the end of the slimy spring galaxy in Super Mario Galaxy 2, and I remember the grounds around the castle in Super Mario 64 being peaceful and relaxing. Majora's Mask's moon has the same kind of ambience, but it comes as a shock because it contrasts so strongly amid the chaos and darkness of the game's final moments. Just before the top 10 I'll do some honourable mentions. Death Sword. I remember in Ocarina of Time finding it strange why I was taking damage in one room of the Shadow Temple before using the Lens of Truth and being surprised to find two large scythes rotating around. Twilight Princess took this idea and applied it to a cool mini-boss, where it's similarly strange how all you seem to be fighting is a giant levitating sword, before using Wolf Link to reveal its ghoulish body and face. Gossip Stone launching. The Gossip Stones are mostly useless, yet it's fun finding out what you can do with them. The best being you can explode a bomb next to one, which makes it flash before launching off like a rocket. It's really silly, but it's a nice detail that has some amusing logic to it. Blind. It was a unique way to set up the dungeon and boss by having you escort a maid into a room where she would turn out to be the boss of the dungeon. Twilight Princess would use a similar idea in its Snow Peak ruins with the Blizzetta boss battle. Leviathan Bones. The skeletons in the Gerudo and Elden regions were easy to find, even just on the overworld map, but the one inside a cave took longer, and finally seeing the massive skeleton covering a shrine was a really nice discovery. Mulgera. There's not much to say about the battle itself, but it uses a really nice tune in its soundtrack. Return to Hyrule Castle. It was nice to start off the game by going to Hyrule Castle, and it was also good going back with the upgraded gear and more experience, taking out guards and encountering Aghanim. Shoot for the morning light. If you shoot your bow at the sun during sunrise on Lake Hylia, your arrow will stop in its path towards the sun to turn into the fire arrow. Rather than merely finding it in a treasure chest, this sequence makes getting the item more interesting with the use of a neat and logical riddle. Fight on horseback. Twilight Princess was the first main Zelda game that didn't have the best graphics of any game released in the same year, yet this sequence always looks really good with the setting sun, especially on the bridge. Opening cutscene. I don't find the story or visuals all that compelling, but just the music alone never makes me want to skip it. Golden Gauntlets. This moment highlights just how powerful you've become. You start the game as a child with only 3 hearts and no equipment, but at the end of the game you're an adult, potentially with 20 hearts, all of the equipment, a doubled magic meter, and you've been through many dungeons and enemy encounters. In the last dungeon you get the Golden Gauntlets, which let you lift massive objects. It's a somewhat amusing but still awesome sight to see Link lift a huge pillar of stone, hold it there for a while like a bodybuilder, and cast it aside. The stone crumbles behind him while he looks forward, like when action heroes stare forward as an explosion happens behind them. I like how understated and matter-of-fact it feels too, with no epic music playing, just silence and the sound of adult Link's voice. I think Link needed to be made to look powerful at this stage of the game, if he hadn't already, and this ability was a cool way to make him look properly grown up. Recovering Grandma. This barely has anything in the way of gameplay, it's just a fetch quest, but what people most like about it is the music. It's a surprisingly touching and heartfelt theme in the middle of a cartoon-style game. There's nothing in the way of deep characterization, but the noise the grandma makes when she recovers is amusing in the cutesy way of the Wind Waker. And I also enjoy smashing the plates on the table while the sad music is playing. Ocarina of Time, Mirror Shield. It was an amazing moment when I collected the mirror shield and used it to reflect light for the first time. I couldn't believe the game was still packing in brilliant ideas so late in the game. There was a mirror shield in A Link to the Past, but it wasn't nearly as dynamic or as satisfying to use. In Ocarina of Time you can reflect light anywhere in front of you, and the design on the face of the shield gets cast onto the wall along with the light. The first use of the item is pretty straightforward, just to establish the mechanic, but it feels awesome anyway. A later puzzle made using the item even more imaginative. There's a beam of light shining down in a tight cavernous room high up in the Spirit Temple, and you have to transfer it down all the way to the centre of the dungeon. This involves blowing up walls with bombs and rotating mirrors around, so that the beam of light is reflected multiple times through the correct path. My favourite part was figuring out what you have to do with the beam of light in the large centre room. Just finding myself revisiting this room for the third time in a new part of it felt satisfying, as though the whole dungeon was coming full circle. I felt like I'd been on a long journey getting to these last brilliant moments. It wasn't obvious to me what you had to do on this platform at first. The face of the giant statue was ahead, but it's not like Navi hovered around it to indicate the puzzle's answer. A friend was watching me play at the time, and he suggested that I reflect the light onto the statue using the shield. I tried it and it didn't work at first. I didn't think that the statue could be interacted with in this way. But I tried it again, and then the controller started rumbling and the statue's aged face crumbled away at the harshness of the light. This revealed a secret antechamber inside, leading to the boss room. My friend was surprised to see that it actually worked. The Wind Waker would go on to base a whole dungeon around the mirror shield, and Majora's Mask added an ability to store light temporarily inside mirrors. But Ocarina of Time put the mirror shield to best use, even though it was the series' first attempt at using it in 3D. Majora's Mask, inverting the Stone Tower Temple. Puzzles in dungeons are reset if you go back in time in Majora's Mask, and it's possible you might need to go through a dungeon again if time runs out. But a great feature that solves this problem is that the dungeon's item creates shortcuts. The bow, fire arrow, ice arrow and light arrow all take you to the last parts of their respective dungeons if you got far enough to acquire them. After exploring the Stone Tower Temple, you will eventually get the light arrow, which flips the dungeon upside down. You have to explore through the dungeon again, but now it is set up differently with new puzzles and enemies. Some places look unrecognisable at first, but with more attention you can see that they're the same rooms. Areas that were flooded are now emptied, and lava that was on the floor is now dripping from the ceiling. The dungeon is very extensive, with 2 new mini-boss battles, as well as another Wizrobe, and some unique minor enemies, including the Igor and Deaf Amos, an enemy that fits in nicely with the dungeon's theme and puts the light arrow to good use. I like how the dungeon requires the use of all mask transformations. Some parts even involve you flipping the dungeon around as you progress through it, so it's not just done once from the outside. Navigating around the dungeon and solving some puzzles can be challenging, due to its complex structure. The dungeon's atmosphere is incredible, especially once it has been inverted. The design seems inspired by the Tower of Babel. While in the original tale, the tower was destroyed by a spiteful god, the twist in this game is that it is flipped upside down. So while it was reaching towards the heavens beforehand, suddenly it is dropping down towards hell. While exploring through the dungeon, you can see that it's so high up that you'd feel afraid of falling off edges. However, when the dungeon is upside down, falling off of an edge would result in an infinite drop into the sky. During daytime, sunlight pours upwards from holes in the floor. During nighttime, in the outside areas, it's intimidating to see the starry sky stretched out far below. The dungeon also has a great musical theme that gets altered and warped when the place is upside down. It's as though the Zelda team had put together everything they had learned about dungeon design and made one last epic dungeon for the N64. It's a strong contender for the best dungeon in the entire series. The Legend of Zelda, Dark Nuts. I struggled with the original Zelda game when I first attempted it, because I died very easily to the overworld enemies. Continuing to play it felt like quite a test of perseverance, especially considering how large and daunting the overworld seemed to be. But I'm glad I never gave up on it, since completing it really did feel like an accomplishment. Eventually the game's controls got under my skin, and I learned the patterns and rhythms of its enemies. Mastering the game and going through the overworld was fun because blasting through enemies felt satisfying. You really do become a skilled adventurer. The most fun I had with the game's combat was against the many dark nuts in the 5th dungeon. The blue Wizrobes might have been the hardest enemy, but I preferred the difficulty level of the Dark Nuts. They were challenging, but only so much that I could still defeat them all on the first attempt. It felt genuinely daunting entering rooms where there were several of these enemies. I immediately thought I would die, as it seemed like too much to take on. Attacking them might seem straightforward, but the way they quickly turn around can be surprising. Finally finishing the last one and completing the dungeon was wonderfully satisfying. Later Zelda games, especially from A Link to the Past onward, tried lots of different things to add to the adventure, but the original Zelda feels like the purest of them all. It's a timeless classic, and taking on its enemies such as the Dark Nuts will always be fun. Ocarina of Time, Ganondorf boss battle. Heading towards Ganondorf in his castle is really exciting. After the trials you face some Lizalfos, Stalfos and Iron Knuckles, but besides that there's no other gameplay. It doesn't need it. Just like when you pick up the Master Sword in the Temple of Time, the experience and atmosphere is enough. The majestic music sets up an effectively foreboding tone before the fight. The music gets louder the closer you get to Ganondorf, and then it's neat to discover when you reach his room that he's the one playing the piece on an organ. Ganondorf's visual design is imposingly realistic. Unlike other characters in the game, his hands actually have separated fingers. Link's hands are just hand-shaped blocks with lines drawn in to indicate fingers. This difference gives Ganondorf an authoritative presence, as though he deserves more detail. The rooms in Ganon's castle are luxurious and majestic. The red carpet provides a royal atmosphere, setting a grand stage. The fight with Ganondorf is another instance of deflecting magical spells, but it's made more exciting by the way the platforms on which you stand start breaking away. Being able to hookshot your way to and from Ganondorf creates a lot of exciting motion. Plus, falling to the area far below and having to climb back up makes you feel like you're scrambling your way towards victory. Possibly the most striking visual effects in the game were reserved for Ganondorf. The animation of him throwing huge bolts of energy towards you is a truly epic sight. Watching Ganondorf's body become electrocuted by a light arrow is also stunning, and it pushed the N64 to its limits. Once defeated temporarily inside his castle, Ganondorf clutches his throat, breathes heavily and throws up blood, as though he's an actual human being with weakness and frailty. In the original unedited version of the game, the blood was red rather than green. It can be unsettling to see such a dark and realistic figure in an otherwise light and whimsical game. He calls us a boy when we first see him, and continues to refer to us as a child when we encounter him as an adult. But after we have defeated him, he stops calling us a boy and uses our file name, as though we've won his respect. It's also neat how his robes become tattered as he takes damage during the fight. All of these details make up for an awesome encounter that could have easily made for a satisfying end for any normal game. Breath of the Wild, turning Vah Ruta's trunk. I absolutely loved being inside the divine beasts of Breath of the Wild. My favourite was Vah Ruta, which was the second divine beast for me. As good as the overworld exploration was, I felt like the Zelda team were back to doing what they did best with the dungeon design. It's not quite as challenging as the games have been elsewhere, but it's still awe-inspiring and a lot of fun. I love turning the massive trunk in divine beast Vah Ruta each and every time. Seeing it appear in the distance above with its gushing water was a spectacle to behold. It's accompanied by the mighty cries of the beast and the enthralling spine-tingling soundtrack. The events to activate the dungeon's terminals are clever and fun to play, using stasis at the right time to stop a water mill turning, making the trunk spill water onto the mill so you can use it to climb up further on, climbing up the trunk all the way to its tip using the paraglider, and turning the trunk back again to extinguish a circle of fire in a room below. It all controlled really well and felt logical. I'm really impressed by functional objects that are repurposed in different ways and manage to fit together so satisfyingly. Seeing the beast's face as you're on its trunk with the overworld in the background is another stunning sight. You could accuse the divine beasts of being a bit short, but they still make for some sensational highlights. Ocarina of Time, Ganon. The best thing about the battle with Ganon is how intense its atmosphere feels. The remains of the destroyed castle, along with thunder, lightning and a wall of flames, makes for a great stage. Ganon looks spectacular with his massive blades. The low-key lighting shrouds his body in darkness, while flashes of lightning temporarily illuminate his greenish skin. His attacks take off a lot of damage, but if you're quick you can narrowly evade his horizontal strikes in midair with a backflip. Plus the way you can roll between his legs while he tries to strike you is really cool. His defeat has been given some brutal emphasis. It's sickly satisfying to see the glowing Master Sword stab Ganon right in the face and stay there for a while. The game is dark and gritty in its final moments before the end. It's a shame the 3DS version made the boss battle so bright. Maybe it looked too dark on a handheld system. On the N64 it feels brilliant. It's also great how dramatic the cutscene before the fight feels, and it shows off how effective minimalism in cutscenes can be. An exasperated Ganondorf emerges out of the debris of his collapsed castle, and raises his fist to show the Triforce of Power still shining on the back of his hand. Then he transforms into Ganon for the last battle. No words need to be spoken. The music is completely epic. Even though it's a really old game now, the visual simplicity here still remains to be wonderfully powerful and dramatic. Majora's Mask. Majora's Mask boss battle. The final boss in Majora's Mask for me was like what people say they go through when they fight a boss in Dark Souls. I probably died over 50 times when I played this as a child, and many times when I played it as an adult too. The difficulty I experienced was a good thing. I suppose casual players could use the Fierce Deity mask to make the fight completely cheap, although doing so requires getting all masks in the overworld, which in itself is a huge feat. The second time I played Majora's Mask, I got the Fierce Deity mask at the end, but when I saw how easy it was making the fight as it went on, I went back in time or reset the game. I feel sorry for those who used that mask in this last boss battle. The visual design on Fierce Deity Link is impressive, but it completely breaks the fight and makes the overall experience a lot weaker. For me, the final fight in this game was an amazing experience. The atmosphere was intense, with the game being just as dark as Ocarina of Time's final dungeons, but also adding a strange, creepier tone. Just seeing the Majora's Mask itself floating in the arena as the battle begins is unexpected. The music starts off slow, enhancing the strangeness of the moment. Then the fight gets really bizarre in the second stage, as the mask develops tall but flimsy limbs, and sprints and dances frenetically across the arena. The music becomes jangly, and the cries of the boss sound oddly childlike. Then the mask gets into its final stage, with thicker limbs and two powerful whips. Its garish body looks like its skin has turned inside out. It makes harrowing shrieks and manic laughter. It's quite unsettling seeing what seems like a large woman fighting and tossing a child around the stage using her whips. This is the more serious encounter of the boss battle, and the truly challenging part. You have to learn its animations to know when to shoot an arrow to stun it. Its movement can be very quick at times, so you won't have long to attack it. I opted to wear the bunny hood to quicken my movement. I also made sure to save up arrows during some stages by using the Zora mask, so the battle makes a pretty good requirement of item usage and strategy. I love how quick it is to transform using masks in the middle of a fight. It doesn't slow the action down at all. There's not really any animation as cool as when Ganondorf casts his biggest attack in Ocarina of Time, although the sight of seeing the boss get electrocuted through the whips from Zora Link is pretty cool. When she is low on health, she will cast spinning tops with spikes at you, which adds to the tension as you're trying desperately to land the final hits on her. Finally defeating the boss and seeing the game's time cycle come to an end is hugely climactic. I always love it when the cutscene after enters the fourth day. The saying, "the darkest hour is just before the dawn," is very relevant to this game. Ocarina of Time, 7-year time shift. Shigeru Miyamoto explained that the story is just one of the ways to get the players interested. The difference is in the participation. The scenario, characters and graphics are all important, but it's this active attitude that is the most important element. If playing the game just to experience clever, imaginative game design wasn't enough, the story events can help entice the player to continue. A dramatic moment in Ocarina of Time's storyline that keeps the player motivated comes a third of the way through when you realise you have travelled 7 years into the future. The first sight you see when you step outside the Temple of Time is a decimated Hyrule town. It comes as a complete contrast to how the town looked before. Many villains in games and films threaten to take over the world, but never get to do so. But the villain in this game does exactly what he says he's going to do, and seeing the land transformed motivates the player to put things right. It gives you the urge to run to every location again to see what has happened. Across the world there will be plenty of changes to discover. Hyrule Castle has been replaced by Ganon's Castle, Ingo has taken over the ranch, characters have relocated to Kakariko Village, the Gravedigger has died, Kokiri Forest has been invaded by enemies, the Gorons are being fed to a dragon, the Carpenters have been imprisoned, and the lake is dried up. Perhaps the biggest surprise is to see Zora's domain completely frozen over. More general locations in the overworld don't show quite as much difference, but the designers chose to make changes in places where it really counts. These are all other good moments in the game, but they were all made possible due to the one incredible moment when you pull out the Master Sword and become an adult. Including a 7-year time shift inside the Temple of Time was a masterstroke. As if the transition the series made into 3D wasn't enough, Ocarina of Time also brought forth this time-based mechanic, and made it an absorbing, revelatory experience of ingenious design that only video games can achieve. Majora's Mask, becoming Zora Link. Deku Link and Goron Link had their own nice abilities, but I think they saved the best until last with Zora Link. I'm not sure if I can remember even imagining we'd be playing as a Zora when playing Majora's Mask for the first time, so it would have come as a great surprise. In any case, I remember instantly thinking that Zora Link was really cool. It's neat taking on the role of someone who died, but lived a life you then get to explore. Taking on the form of Mikau is an effective storytelling technique. By communicating with his friends and solving his dilemmas, we learn about who he was and become connected to the world he inhabited. It's an interesting style of storytelling, and well suited to the form of a video game. The idea of making Zora's musicians and turning Zora's domain into a concert hall made things interesting and added a lot more character to the game. But the best thing about being Zora Link is all the new abilities you get. You can play on a guitar like a rock star, you can cast fins into the air like boomerangs, you can do a backwards flip while jumping forwards, but the feature that made the transformation absolutely incredible for me was the swimming ability. Every time I get the mask I run towards the sea like a giddy child. It's so satisfying how fast you can swim through water. I also love dolphin flipping out of water onto land, it feels so elegant. Maybe the clumsier players out there would have a hard time controlling it, and I'm guessing that's why the swimming was slowed down for the 3DS remake, which I think completely botches the whole experience. On the N64 it feels wonderful, and getting the hang of it really shouldn't be too much trouble. They added in the ability to sink to the bottom of water, as if you're wearing the iron boots, just by pressing the A button. It feels seamless going from swimming to walking. There's also the ability to zap creatures underwater like an electric eel. There's a lot of control at your fingertips. Power-ups and ability progression in Zelda can be an amazing part of the adventure, and getting the Zora mask for me was the best example of this. Ocarina of Time, Twisted Corridors. The distinctive structure of Ocarina of Time's dungeons made them daunting, exciting and memorable. The Water Temple probably had the most challenging layout. Others like the Shadow Temple and Spirit Temple were linear, but full of fun puzzles and events. Maybe the Forest Temple struck the best middle ground. It's full of cool stuff and its layout can leave players disorientated. I remember going down into one well and out another and wondering whether I had stumbled into the same courtyard somehow. Many forget about the very first room of the dungeon, where they sneakily hid a key at the top. The Poe Sisters are a great way of distinguishing the dungeon and making it eventful. I really like how creepy it is when they disappear from paintings when you get near them. But the best section of this dungeon is the left side area containing twisted corridors, where it might confuse you at first as to why there are inaccessible chests and shallow pits on the surrounding walls. I watched the speedrunner ZFG show off the twisted corridor in an editor, displaying its properties and how it works. The designers created the corridor so that it really is twisted. It's not just a visual trick. They then programmed the corridor to rotate based on the player's movement through the corridor along a specific coordinate, so it will be fully turned around when you reach the other side. The cube-shaped room adjacent to the corridor is attached, so it rotates onto its side in real time along with everything else, changing the structure of the dungeon and opening or closing different pathways. There are 2 twisted corridors, and the second one involves my favourite puzzle of any Zelda game. It takes place in a room where there are 4 moving platforms, rotating around a centre platform which has a burning torch on it, and a switch is on the wall, covered in ice. You have to stand on a moving platform and align a shot from your bow that will pass through the burning torch, setting the arrow alight in mid-air, and strike the switch, melting the ice. It's fun to get that eureka moment when you figured out what to do, and it's a fun activity to perform. The reward of the cutscene, seeing the corridor outside get twisted and open the way forward, is also hugely satisfying. It fits in perfectly with the dungeon's theme of illusion and haunting spirits. I felt like the dungeon was alive and changing around me, which it really was. The forest temple music helped as well, making the dungeon feel strange and paranormal. Not just any game developer could come up with this kind of design. It's spectacularly creative and cleverly engineered, making for an absorbing experience going through these dungeons.